I risked my own life pulling my mother from the edge of a cliff, only to watch her pull a knife and slice through my safety rope seconds later. As I plummeted 70 feet into a freezing river, my body shattering against the rocks and branches, my mind seized on one impossible truth. Her tears were never for me, and my death was her retirement plan. My name is Sarah. I am 29 years old, a forensic accountant, and the woman who survived her own murder. The wind howling through the Cascade Mountains was deafening, but it was nothing compared to the roaring in my ears as my muscles screamed in agony. I was dangling over the edge of a jagged vertical gorge, my boots scrambling for purchase against the slick, rain-washed granite. Just 3 feet above me, my mother Brenda lay flat on her stomach on the safety of a wide stable ledge. I had just spent the last 10 minutes burning every ounce of adrenaline in my body to haul her up there. She had slipped. That was what I thought had happened. One misstep on the wet trail, a panicked scream, and suddenly she was sliding toward the abyss. I had spent my entire life catching her when she stumbled, balancing her checkbook when she overspent, and cleaning up the financial messes she and my sister left behind. Lunging forward to save her from the edge of the cliff was just pure instinct. It was what I was conditioned to do. I had quickly anchored my harness to a sturdy Douglas fir and grabbed her wrist just as her boots lost contact with the trail. I hauled her up inch by agonizing inch until she finally scrambled onto the flat rock. My chest heaved as I hung there, suspended entirely by my main climbing rope. My forearms were trembling so violently I could barely feel my own fingers. My harness dug deeply into my thighs, biting through the fabric of my hiking pants. But I smiled. I looked up at the gray, overcast sky and smiled because I had saved her. She was safe. I looked up at her, waiting for her to reach down and help me pull myself over the final rocky lip. I just needed her to grab my wrist, just to offer a few pounds of leverage so I could get my center of gravity over the ledge. "Mom!" I gasped, my voice raw and scraped thin by the mountain wind. "Reach down. I cannot pull myself up. My arms are completely shot." She shifted closer to the edge, looking down at me, but she did not reach out her hand. The terrified, panicked mother I had just risked my own life to save was completely gone. In her place was a woman I did not recognize at all. Her face was completely slack. Her eyes, usually wide and expressive, were flat and cold. There was no hysteria, no tears, no frantic relief. It was the face of someone executing a calculated business transaction. "Mom," I said again, a cold spike of confusion piercing right through my physical exhaustion. "What are you doing? Please grab my hand." Brenda did not speak. She kept her eyes locked dead on mine as she slowly reached her right hand into the top-zippered pouch of her hiking pack. She pulled something out. The overcast daylight caught the dull gray steel of a tactical survival knife. It was a heavy serrated blade she had bought specifically for this camping trip, claiming she wanted to feel safe in the remote wilderness. My brain, trained by years of forensic accounting to analyze data and find logical patterns, completely stalled. The math simply did not add up. The professional in me tried to process what I was seeing, but the daughter in me completely rejected it. For 29 years, I believed that beneath her critical remarks and her blatant favoritism toward my sister, there was at least a foundation of maternal love. I thought she was just difficult. I thought she was just flawed. "Mom, stop!" I wheezed, raw panic finally replacing the physical exhaustion. "Stop. That is not funny. Pull me up right now." She knelt right at the edge of the cliff. She brought the sharp serrated edge of the heavy blade directly against the thick woven nylon of my main safety rope, the very rope that was currently holding my entire body weight over a 70-foot drop. She looked me right in the eyes. I expected to see a flash of hesitation, maybe a glimmer of guilt, or even a sudden snap of insanity. I saw absolutely nothing. She pressed the blade down and sawed it firmly across the tensioned rope. I heard the terrible, distinct sound of the synthetic fibers popping. It sounded like a series of rapid-fire firecrackers. Snap, snap, snap. And then came the absolute weightlessness. The sudden absence of tension is a profound physical shock. My stomach vaulted into my throat as gravity claimed me. I did not scream. There was no air left in my burning lungs to scream. The jagged walls of the gorge became a gray and brown blur, rushing rapidly upward past my face. The wind, which had been howling, suddenly transformed into a high-pitched shriek directly in my ears. I was falling 70 feet. In those few seconds, time completely warped. It stretched and slowed, expanding the horror into an agonizing, crystal-clear reality. My mind detached from the physical terror of the plunge and locked entirely onto the image of Brenda's cold, calculated stare. She cut the rope. My mother cut the rope. As I watched the gray sky pull away from me, the illusion of my family shattered completely. She was not flawed. She was lethal. I hid the tree line first. The gorge was lined with ancient, massive pine trees jutting out from the lower rock face. That deep canopy was the only thing that kept me from dying on direct impact. I crashed violently through the thick green branches. Heavy boughs whipped across my face and chest, tearing right through my jacket, ripping my skin, and violently snapping my momentum. I heard the sickening crunch of my own bones as a thick branch collided heavily with my right side, fracturing multiple ribs in a fraction of a second. My right arm caught the full brunt of a secondary trunk, and I felt the bone shatter with a white-hot flash of blinding agony. But those trees broke my terminal velocity. Instead of hitting the river bottom at a lethal speed, I tumbled through the last layer of pine needles and plunged violently into the freezing glacier water below. The impact felt like hitting a wall of solid concrete. The cold was instantaneous and absolute, driving every remaining ounce of oxygen from my lungs like a physical punch. The sheer force of the river tumbling down from the mountain peaks felt like it was trying to rip my limbs from their sockets. The current immediately dragged me under, spinning me in a dark, chaotic churn of white water and jagged river rocks. The pain in my shattered arm and crushed ribs was a living, breathing monster tearing at my fading consciousness. I fought blindly, kicking my heavy boots against the violent current, desperate to find the surface. I broke the surface just long enough to gasp a single ragged breath of icy air before the rapids pulled me deep under again. As the freezing water rushed over my head and the darkness began to close in rapidly on the edges of my vision, the physical agony finally faded into the background. The only thing left echoing over and over in the blackness of my failing mind was the clean, crisp sound of a serrated knife slicing through nylon. The return to consciousness was not peaceful or gradual. It felt exactly like clawing my way upward through thick layers of suffocating black mud. The very first thing I registered was the steady, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor echoing in a quiet space. Then came the smell. It was that sharp chemical scent of medical-grade bleach mixed with sterile cotton and iodine. I tried to open my eyes, but the harsh fluorescent light burning directly above me forced them tightly shut again. When I finally managed to peel my eyelids apart, the room slowly swam into focus. I was lying in a hospital bed surrounded by a fortress of humming machines and silver poles holding bags of clear fluid. My entire body was a landscape of pure, absolute agony. Every single breath I took felt like pieces of shattered glass, grinding together deep inside my chest. My ribs were tightly bound in heavy medical wraps. My right arm was elevated on a stack of stiff hospital pillows and encased in a thick, heavy cast from my shoulder all the way down to my swollen fingers. I tried to shift my weight just a fraction of an inch, and a sharp, ragged gasp escaped my dry throat. The memory of the freezing river water, the jagged gray rocks, and the terrifying freefall slammed into my brain all at once. My mother, the tactical knife, the climbing rope snapping. A tall man wearing a rumpled brown suit stepped into my narrow line of sight. He had thinning gray hair and tired, observant eyes that looked like they had witnessed decades of human cruelty. He held up a small silver badge so I could see it clearly. "I am Detective Miller," he said, his voice low and steady and remarkably gentle. "You are in the intensive care unit at Mercy General Hospital. You have been completely unconscious for 3 days, Sarah." 3 days. I tried to speak to ask him what happened, but my throat felt like it was coated in dry sand. He leaned forward and held a small plastic cup of ice water to my cracked lips, guiding a flexible straw so I could take a slow sip. The cool liquid running down my throat felt like an absolute miracle. "You are incredibly lucky to be alive right now," Detective Miller continued as he pulled a vinyl guest chair closer to the side of my bed. A group of backcountry hikers found you washed up on a shallow gravel bank about 4 miles downstream from the main gorge. Your core body temperature was dangerously low when they called the paramedics. Your right arm is completely shattered, and you have 5 broken ribs, but the doctors assure me that you are going to survive this. I swallowed hard, trying to force my vocal cords to work. My mother, I managed to whisper, feeling a fresh spike of terror. The detective leaned forward and rested his elbows heavily on his knees. His expression shifted immediately from sympathetic to entirely professional. That is actually why I am sitting here, waiting for you to wake up. Your mother, Brenda, is currently back in her home in Portland. She's completely safe and completely unharmed. In fact, she has been incredibly busy talking to all the local news stations for the past 2 days. I stared at him, trying desperately to process his words through the thick haze of pain medication. The local news. According to the official statement your mother gave the county sheriff on the day of the incident, Detective Miller explained carefully the 2 of you were hiking near the upper ridge. She claims you lost your footing on some wet shale near the edge. She told our investigators she tried frantically to grab your hand, but you slipped right through her fingers. She reported it as a tragic hiking accident. She even told the press that the river current was so strong she knew your body had been swept all the way out to the ocean. She has already begun making arrangements for an extravagant memorial service. The sheer audacity of the lie made my blood run completely ice cold. A tragic accident. She was playing the heartbroken, grieving mother, mourning the beloved daughter she simply could not save. I felt a violent wave of nausea wash over my bruised body. She thought I was dead. She truly believed the river had swallowed me whole and washed away the only evidence of her crime. She lied, I choked out. The heart monitor beside me began to beat noticeably faster, betraying my rising panic. She did not try to save me. She took a knife out of her bag. She looked right at me and she cut the rope. Detective Miller did not look surprised. He did not write anything down or give me a look of skepticism or disbelief. Instead, he reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. He looked down at the dark screen for a long moment before meeting my eyes again. In my 25 years on the police force, he said quietly, "I have learned that people make stupid, careless mistakes when their adrenaline is running high. When your mother knelt down on the edge of that cliff, she had her cell phone tucked into the side pocket of her hiking pants. In her desperate rush to reach her knife, she accidentally pressed the side button against the rock. She triggered a pocket dial directly to your sister Chloe. Chloe, the golden child. The sister who could do no wrong. The sister who had always looked at my responsible, quiet life with thinly veiled pity and resentment." Chloe did not answer the phone. The detective continued, keeping his voice completely flat. The call went straight to her voicemail box. "Chloe is currently telling everyone in your family that she deleted the message without listening to it because it was just too painful to hear the accident. But we obtained an emergency digital warrant for the cloud storage server early this morning. I need you to listen to this audio file, Sarah. It is going to be incredibly difficult to hear, but you need to understand exactly what we are dealing with here." He tapped the screen of his phone and placed the device gently on the small tray table resting over my lap. At first, there was only the loud, chaotic sound of the mountain wind, a fierce, howling noise crashing violently against the tiny microphone. Then I heard the sound of my own voice captured clearly from just a few feet away. I heard myself pleading in absolute terror. "Stop. That is not funny. Pull me up right now." My breath caught painfully in my throat. Hearing my own desperate panic echoing in this sterile hospital room was entirely surreal. Then came a new sound. It was the heavy, rhythmic friction of a serrated steel blade sawing aggressively against thick woven nylon. It was a terrifying, visceral noise that made my stomach churn. A second later, the audio captured the loud, sharp popping sound of the main climbing rope completely giving way. That was followed instantly by the sudden chilling silence of my disappearance over the edge. The recording did not end there. I heard the loud rustle of fabric as Brenda presumably stood up and retrieved her phone from her pants pocket. I heard her heavy, ragged breathing close to the receiver. She was not crying. She was not screaming my name into the empty gorge. Then my mother spoke. Her voice was perfectly calm and steady. It was the exact same casual tone she used when ordering a morning coffee or asking for the dry cleaning bill. "It is done," Brenda said clearly into the phone. "Make sure she does not survive if they find her." The audio clicked off, leaving a deafening, heavy silence in the hospital room. Make sure she does not survive if they find her. The words slammed right into my chest with the devastating force of a freight train. My world completely imploded in that exact second. This was not a momentary lapse of sanity. This was not a panicked mistake made under pressure. She had spoken directly to my sister immediately after watching me fall 70 feet into a freezing river, and Chloe was part of it. My own mother and my own sister had conspired together to execute me and steal my life. The cardiac monitor beside me began to blare a rapid, frantic rhythm. Detective Miller reached out and placed his large, warm hand gently over my uninjured left arm, grounding me back to the present reality. "They think they got away with it, Sarah," he said, his voice slicing right through my overwhelming shock. "They think you are resting quietly at the bottom of the ocean. They think the money is already theirs, but they do not know I am sitting right here with you. And they certainly do not know that you are about to become their absolute worst nightmare." The morphine drip connected to my arm hummed a quiet mechanical tune in the sterile stillness of the intensive care unit. It was a steady sound, designed to bring comfort, and it successfully dulled the raw physical trauma of my shattered bones. But absolutely no medication on this earth could touch the profound psychological devastation currently tearing through my mind. Lying perfectly rigid beneath the thin hospital blanket, I stared blankly at the white ceiling tiles above me. My right arm throbbed relentlessly inside its heavy elevated cast, and my 5 fractured ribs screamed in protest every time I managed a shallow breath. Yet that immense physical agony felt entirely secondary. The true nightmare was the audio recording Detective Miller had just played for me. The sound of the rope snapping, and my mother, cold and breathless, giving the order to make sure I did not survive, echoed endlessly in my ears. Those few seconds of recorded audio completely severed the final frayed threads of my childhood. To understand how a mother could look her own flesh and blood in the eye and intentionally slice through her only lifeline, you have to understand the sole currency of our family. That currency was always money and the absolute control over it. My father passed away 5 years ago from a sudden massive heart attack. He was a brilliant self-made commercial real estate developer who truly understood the value of a hard-earned dollar. He also possessed a sharp, observant mind that clearly recognized the deep fundamental flaws in the people he lived with. When his final will was unsealed by the estate attorneys, the term sent massive shockwaves through our suburban household. My father had established a $4 million trust fund from his life's work, but he absolutely refused to leave it to his wife. Brenda possessed a terrifying habit of treating wealth like an endless personal playground, and he knew she would burn through his legacy in a matter of years. And he certainly did not leave a single penny of it up front to my older sister, Chloe. Chloe was the quintessential golden child of the family. While I spent my entire teenage years working weekend shifts at a local diner and studying late into the night at the kitchen table, Chloe spent hers maxing out the various credit cards Brenda secretly handed her. When it came time for university, our father generously provided both of us with fully funded college accounts. I used mine to meticulously finance my degree in forensic accounting, ensuring every single dollar was maximized to secure my professional future. Chloe, on the other hand, treated her college fund like a blank check for a 4-year luxury vacation. She blew through the entire substantial amount in less than 5 semesters, spending the cash on designer clothes, expensive sorority dues, and lavish spring break trips to luxury resorts. She eventually dropped out of school entirely the moment she met Todd. Todd was the heir to a very prominent local logistics company. He was flashy, arrogant, and exactly the kind of man Brenda worshipped. When Chloe married him, she stepped effortlessly into a shiny world of sprawling suburban mansions and elite country club memberships. Brenda practically moved in with them, basking daily in the reflected glow of Todd's family wealth. She paraded Chloe around to her friends like a prized show pony, boasting about her successful, beautiful daughter. Meanwhile, I was quietly building my career. I paid my own way through the remainder of my education, passed my certification exams, and took a demanding job at a top-tier accounting firm. I drove a practical 10-year-old sedan, lived in a modest, quiet apartment, and saved my income diligently. Instead of being proud of my financial independence, Brenda treated my lifestyle as a deliberate, personal insult. Every rare family dinner we attended became an open opportunity for her to critique my choices. She would sip her expensive wine, look at my simple professional suits, and sigh heavily. "You are so dreadfully boring, Sarah," she would say, her voice dripping with open condescension. "You sit there analyzing spreadsheets all day, making a good salary, but you live like an absolute pauper. Look at your sister. Chloe actually understands how to enjoy life. You are just stingy. I could never understand why you refuse to live a little. I used to bite my tongue and swallow the hurt feeling like a perpetual disappointment. I thought she just did not understand my desire for financial stability." I never realized her open disdain was actually deeply rooted resentment over the specific terms of my father's will. Because my father had seen right through their expensive, polished facades. He knew exactly what would happen to his commercial real estate empire if Brenda or Chloe gained unrestricted access to the capital. So he structured the $4 million trust with an ironclad, unchangeable condition. The money would remain completely locked and untouchable until my 30th birthday. On that exact day, the entire trust would transfer legally and solely into my control. I was designated as the sole trustee and the primary beneficiary. My father trusted my practical nature and my strict professional training as a forensic accountant to protect the family assets from ruin. He gave me the absolute authority to distribute funds to Brenda and Chloe only if I deemed it necessary and responsible. As I lay trapped in that hospital bed listening to the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor, the timeline suddenly clicked into sharp, terrifying focus. I am 29 years old. My 30th birthday was exactly 3 months away. 90 days. In exactly 90 days, I would gain absolute legal control over $4 million. Brenda and Chloe knew that once I held the purse strings, the endless luxury handouts they felt entitled to would permanently stop. They knew I would heavily audit the family finances and demand strict accountability. My professional life was dedicated to finding hidden money and exposing fraud. They knew I would instantly see through their lies, and I would never fund Chloe's hidden debts or Brenda's lavish shopping sprees. They did not just view me as a boring, stingy disappointment. I was a massive financial roadblock, standing directly between them and a $4 million payday. The sudden bonding hiking trip was never about a mother wanting to make amends with her reliable daughter. It was a meticulously timed execution. If I died before my 30th birthday, the legal stipulations of the trust would trigger a default clause, transferring the assets directly back to the surviving family members, namely Brenda. The cold, hard truth settled heavily over my broken body. My mother did not snap under the pressure of an emergency on that cliff. She had dragged me up that mountain with a tactical knife in her bag and a clear, calculated plan to murder me for a very specific dollar amount. I looked at the detective, the heavy fog of the morphine momentarily pushed aside by the sheer adrenaline of my own sickening epiphany. He asked me a simple question. He wanted to know why we were up on that specific mountain ridge miles away from the marked tourist paths on a stormy Friday afternoon. I closed my eyes and let the memory of the past month wash over me. The trap had not been set on the slippery granite of the Cascade Mountains. It had been set in my own living room 4 weeks earlier. It started with a phone call from my sister Chloe. She was frantic, sobbing hysterically into the receiver, telling me that our mother had collapsed at her exclusive country club luncheon. I rushed to the hospital, abandoning a massive corporate audit file on my desk, completely terrified that I was about to lose my only remaining parent. When I arrived, Brenda was lying in a private suite, looking pale and unusually fragile. She clutched my hand and gave a tearful, breathless speech about a serious cardiac episode. She told me the doctors had warned her that her heart was failing, that she might not have much time left. She wept openly, begging for my forgiveness. She said she knew she had been harsh over the years, that she had clearly favored Chloe, and that her absolute biggest regret in life was the wedge she had driven between us. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my entire life demanding solid proof, verifying financial documents, and looking for the lie in every corporate statement. But when my own mother looked at me with tears streaming down her face, telling me she desperately wanted to make amends before she died, I completely dropped my professional guard. I wanted a mother. I desperately wanted the family connection I had been denied for 29 years. I hugged her carefully amidst the hospital wires. I told her we would fix everything. That was my fatal mistake. 2 weeks after her miraculous recovery, she called me with a very specific, sentimental request. She said she wanted to honor my late father. She wanted the two of us, just mother and daughter, to hike up to Eagle Point. It was my father's absolute favorite remote trail. He used to take us there when I was a little girl, back when we were still a real family. She insisted we go alone, claiming she wanted a deeply personal spiritual moment, to scatter some of his old ashes she had saved. She specifically requested we take the old logging route, a dangerous, unmaintained path that hugged the steep edge of the river gorge. She said it was the exact route my father had loved most, away from the loud crowds of tourists. I opened my eyes and looked directly at Detective Miller. The quiet horror of the absolute truth was settling deep into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. She planned every single step of that hike. I whispered, my voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth. The detective leaned forward, his pen hovering steadily over his yellow notepad. "Tell me exactly what you mean, Sarah. What you need?" My mind was racing, connecting the scattered data points with ruthless precision. I broke it down for him, just like a fraud case. When we started the hike, Brenda was the one setting the pace. For a woman who supposedly just suffered a major cardiac event, she climbed the steep elevation with remarkable stamina. I had offered to carry her heavy hiking pack, but she absolutely refused to let me touch it. She insisted on wearing it the entire time. Of course she did. That nylon pack held the heavy tactical survival knife she would soon use to execute me. Then I thought about the exact location where she slipped. She had stopped specifically at a narrow, sleek outcropping of shale that jutted directly over the deepest, most violent part of the river gorge. She had pointed down at the freezing water, telling me she suddenly felt dizzy. When I stepped forward to guide her safely back to the solid side of the trail, she shifted her weight perfectly toward the abyss. It was not an accident. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as the final puzzle pieces locked firmly into place. "Detective," I said, she chose the absolute deadliest drop on that entire mountain. If she had slipped 50 feet earlier, she would have landed on a wide gravel shelf. If she had slipped 50 feet later, the dense tree line would have easily caught her body. But that one specific spot offered a sheer, unobstructed 70-foot vertical plunge into violent rapids filled with jagged granite boulders. She knew I would catch her. She knew my exact reaction would be to anchor myself and haul her up. I am the reliable daughter. I am the one who fixes everything when she and Chloe make a mess. She weaponized my own fundamental nature against me. She used my ingrained loyalty as the bait, my physical strength as the anchor, and my deep love for my late father as the perfect excuse to get me completely isolated in the wilderness. Detective Miller stopped writing. The silence in the intensive care unit felt incredibly heavy. The terrible gravity of what I was describing hung in the sterile air between us. This was not a sudden crime of passion. I continued, my voice gaining strength as the pure, unadulterated fury finally began to burn right through my initial shock. This was not a desperate mother making a split-second decision out of sudden greed. She faked a heart condition just to get me to lower my emotional boundaries. She selected a remote location where we would not encounter a single witness to hear me scream. She bought a serrated steel blade specifically capable of slicing through heavy-duty climbing gear in a matter of seconds. She orchestrated every single variable to ensure my violent death would look exactly like a tragic wilderness accident. I looked down at my shattered arm and the thick white bandages wrapping my broken ribs. The physical pain was still agonizing, but a powerful new sensation was rapidly taking over. It was a cold, absolute resolve. Brenda had spent 29 years making me feel like I was a boring, stingy disappointment. She had tried to casually erase me from the earth just to fund a lavish, empty lifestyle for her golden child. She truly thought she had outsmarted a woman whose entire professional career was built on dismantling complex frauds and sending arrogant criminals to federal prison. She made one critical miscalculation. She did not wait to make sure I was actually dead. I looked back at the detective. My tears of betrayal were completely gone, replaced by absolute focus. I need my laptop, Detective Miller. I need you to securely retrieve my work computer from my apartment, and I need a safe internet connection right here in this hospital bed. If my mother wants to play a high-stakes game of deception and financial ruin, I'm going to show her exactly how a forensic accountant plays to win. The steady hum of the medical equipment in my room felt entirely different now. It was no longer a comforting sound of recovery, but the relentless ticking of a dangerous clock. Detective Miller walked back into my intensive care unit later that evening with a hardened expression that immediately put my bruised nerves on high alert. He pulled his vinyl guest chair much closer to the side of my bed and leaned in carefully so his voice would absolutely not carry past the heavy wooden door. The serious gravity in his observant eyes told me the situation outside these hospital walls was escalating much faster than either of us had initially anticipated. Sarah, he began, carefully keeping his tone perfectly level and strictly professional. We have a rapidly developing situation on our hands. My colleagues back at the precinct just intercepted some highly unusual and aggressive legal paperwork. Your mother has officially filed a formal petition for a preliminary death certificate. I stared at him, trying desperately to comprehend the sheer speed and audacity of her profound betrayal. I had been missing for barely 72 hours. Under normal circumstances, authorities wait weeks or even months before officially declaring a missing hiker permanently deceased. But Brenda was definitely not waiting for nature to take its natural course or for search and rescue teams to thoroughly scour the riverbanks for my remains. She is aggressively pushing the local magistrate to expedite the official declaration of death. Detective Miller explained, his voice tight with frustration. She claimed directly to the presiding judge that the sheer volume of the freezing water and the jagged rocks make survival completely impossible. She is heavily leveraging her status as a prominent grieving widow and actively using her country club connections to apply serious pressure to the local courts. She stated on the official record that your family desperately needs immediate closure to begin the emotional healing process. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sent sharp, agonizing spikes of pain directly through my broken ribs. She does not want emotional closure, I said, gripping the thin hospital blanket tightly with my good hand. She wants absolute control of the trust fund. If I am declared legally dead, the entire $4 million defaults directly into her hands before my 30th birthday. Exactly, the detective nodded solemnly, but a specific legal maneuver also puts you in immense and immediate danger. If Brenda or Chloe somehow find out that you survived that horrific fall, they will instantly realize their entire multi-million-dollar inheritance is gone forever. More importantly, they will realize they are facing serious federal prison time for attempted murder. Desperate people do incredibly dangerous things, Sarah. If your mother knows you are currently lying in a hospital bed, completely immobilized and heavily medicated, she might attempt to finish the brutal job she started on that mountain. A freezing cold shiver ran rapidly down my spine. The terrifying image of my mother pulling out the tactical knife flashed vividly behind my eyes. I knew the detective was absolutely right. Brenda would not hesitate for a single second to slip into my room, disguised as a grieving parent, and tamper with my intravenous lines. What do we do? I asked, my voice remaining steady despite the lingering physical agony radiating through my shattered arm. You are going to disappear, he replied firmly. We are transferring you tonight to a highly secure out-of-county medical facility under a strict and confidential alias. From this exact moment forward, your legal name to my Jane Doe. You will have absolutely no visitors, no outgoing phone calls, and absolutely no digital footprint connected to your real identity. To the outside world, Sarah is officially gone. You're going to play dead until we are completely ready to strike back. I agreed without a single second of hesitation. Later that exact night, I was quietly loaded into the back of an unmarked private ambulance and driven 2 hours away to a private rehabilitation center. My new room was stark and quiet, equipped with advanced security protocols, and a single small television mounted high in the corner. I was officially a ghost. The true crushing weight of my new reality hit me the very next afternoon. I was propped up carefully on a stack of firm medical pillows, trying hard to ignore the deep aching throb in my bones when I turned on the local news channel. The anchor was reporting live from the police precinct back in my hometown. The bright red breaking news banner at the bottom of the screen read, "Tragic disappearance in the Cascades." Then the camera cut directly to the press conference, and all the air completely left my lungs. There stood Brenda, standing directly behind a thick cluster of media microphones. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored dark navy suit, looking the very perfect picture of understated elegance and profound tragedy. Around her neck, she wore my late father's absolute favorite string of vintage pearls. It was a deeply calculated wardrobe choice, designed specifically to evoke maximum sympathy from anyone watching the broadcast. Standing immediately to her right was my sister Chloe. Chloe was wearing large dark sunglasses and gripping a crumpled white tissue, holding her mother's hand tightly, as if they were the only two people left surviving in the entire world. I watched in absolute horrified fascination as my mother leaned slightly into the microphones. Her voice trembled with perfect heartbreaking precision. It was a terrifying masterclass in emotional manipulation. "My beautiful, wonderful Sarah," she sobbed heavily, dabbing at her completely dry eyes with a monogrammed lace handkerchief. She was the absolute brightest light of our entire family. We were just taking a quiet, peaceful hike to honor my late husband. I reached out for her frantically when she slipped. I swear to you, I reached out as far as my arms could possibly go, but the heavy rain made the rocks so terribly slick. I watched my precious daughter fall, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to save her. Chloe leaned her head heavily onto Brenda's shoulder, playing the role of the devastated, grieving sibling flawlessly. "We just want to bring her home," Chloe whispered softly into the microphones, her voice breaking with fabricated grief. "Please, keep our family in your daily prayers during this completely unimaginable nightmare." The sheer theatrical brilliance of their public performance made me physically sick to my stomach. They were standing boldly in front of the entire world, crying desperately over a tragic accident they had meticulously planned and orchestrated. They were blatantly using my horrific plunge into a freezing river as a twisted public relations stunt to fast-track a massive multi-million-dollar payout. Brenda looked directly into the camera lens, her eyes wide and mournful, and begged the local community for strict privacy and support while she processed her profound, agonizing loss. She did not look like a ruthless murderer. She looked exactly like a heartbroken mother. That was the most terrifying part of all. Society is deeply conditioned to implicitly trust a grieving parent. Absolutely no one looking at that television screen would ever suspect that the elegant woman weeping behind the wooden podium had calmly and deliberately sawed through a climbing rope just days prior. I muted the television, letting the heavy silence fill my secure room once again. My pulse drummed a steady, resolute beat against my bruised skin. The physical pain in my shattered arm was absolutely nothing compared to the fiery determination now aggressively flooding my veins. Brenda and Chloe were currently celebrating their flawless victory, entirely convinced that they had successfully outsmarted everyone. They truly thought I was rotting quietly at the bottom of a river gorge and that their luxurious financial future was permanently secured. But I was breathing. I was thinking. I was aggressively analyzing every single piece of their massive public lie. Playing dead was not an act of submission or surrender. It was the ultimate tactical advantage. As I lay silently in that anonymous hospital bed, I slowly opened the secure laptop Detective Miller had cautiously provided. I had a massive amount of forensic accounting to do and a mountain of hidden family secrets to completely dismantle. The ghost was finally going to work. The heavy pain medication Detective Miller had authorized was finally wearing off, leaving a sharp throbbing ache radiating from my shattered arm down to my fingertips. But I refused to press the call button for another dose. I needed my mind to be absolutely clear. Propped up against a mountain of stiff hospital pillows in my anonymous secure room, I rested the encrypted laptop on my lap. The bright glow of the screen illuminated the dark room, casting long shadows across the sterile walls. My body was broken, but my brain was currently firing on all cylinders. Forensic accounting is not just about crunching numbers. It is about understanding human behavior. People lie all the time, but money always tells the absolute truth. You just have to know exactly where to look. Before my father passed away, I had set up the initial financial infrastructure for his trust and managed the primary family accounts. Brenda and Chloe had locked me out of the personal, day-to-day banking years ago, but they were incredibly lazy when it came to digital security. They reused the same passwords they had used since high school. Furthermore, as a certified fraud examiner, I possessed the tools and the knowledge to legally access public property databases. corporate registry filings, and uniform commercial code records. I cracked my knuckles, wincing at the sharp pull in my ribs, and began to dig deep into my sister's perfectly curated life. Chloe projected the ultimate image of suburban royalty. She drove a pristine white luxury SUV, wore seasonal designer collections, and frequently posted pictures of her lavish charity galas at the local country club. Todd's family logistics company was highly successful, so everyone naturally assumed Chloe was simply spending her husband's vast fortune. But as I pulled up the public deeds and tax records associated with their massive estate, a completely different story began to emerge. There was a massive secondary lien on their property, a predatory high-interest loan taken out less than 14 months ago. The signature on the digital filing belonged solely to Chloe. I dug deeper, tracing the corporate registration of the lender. It was not a traditional bank. It was a shadowy offshore holding company notorious for providing fast, untraceable cash to desperate people at extortionate interest rates. They were essentially high-end loan sharks. My heart beat faster against my fractured ribs as my fingers flew across the keyboard. It made absolutely no sense why the wife of a wealthy logistics heir would ever need to borrow money from a predatory lender. I bypassed the standard public records and utilized a secure proxy to view the foundational tax filings for Todd's family business. Because I had previously audited a subsidiary of their company years ago, I knew exactly how their vendor payment system was structured. I ran a standard forensic search looking for duplicate vendor addresses, mismatched tax identification numbers, and sequential invoice anomalies. It only took me 45 minutes to find the massive bleeding wound in their corporate accounts. Chloe had created 3 separate dummy corporations. She gave them generic names that sounded like standard shipping contractors and registered them to virtual office addresses. Over the past 2 years, she had been systematically generating fake invoices for phantom logistics services and routing the payments directly into these shell accounts. The sheer volume of the theft was absolutely staggering. I pulled out my digital calculator and ran the final sum. She had embezzled exactly $2.5 million from her husband's family business. I sat back against the pillows completely stunned. $2.5 million. Chloe was not living a life of luxury. She was living inside a massive ticking time bomb. The offshore loan sharks were charging her exorbitant interest simply to keep up the daily facade of her country club lifestyle, while the embezzled corporate funds were being frantically used to pay off her mounting secret personal debts. She had dug a hole so incredibly deep that there was absolutely no way out. Then the timeline struck me with the force of a physical blow. Todd's family business operated on a strict fiscal calendar. Their massive annual corporate audit was scheduled for the end of October. It was currently late August. In less than 8 weeks, external auditors would descend on that logistics firm. They would trace the dummy vendors. They would follow their wire transfers directly to Chloe. The second Todd and his powerful, ruthless family discovered she had stolen millions of dollars from their legacy, they would not just divorce her. They would utterly destroy her. They would hand her directly to the authorities, and Chloe would be facing decades in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. Everything suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. The sudden mother-daughter bonding trip. The fake cardiac episode. The sheer urgency in my mother's eyes when she sawed through my climbing rope. This was never just about Brenda wanting luxury shopping money or hating my boring lifestyle. This was an act of absolute desperate survival for her golden child. They needed a massive untraceable cash injection to silently replace the $2.5 million in Todd's corporate accounts before the October audit. My $4 million trust fund was the only available lifeline. But because I was the strict, reliable trustee, they knew I would demand to see their financial statements before releasing a single dime. I would have instantly discovered the embezzlement, and I would have absolutely refused to make myself an accessory to a federal crime. The only way to access the money without any oversight was to trigger the default inheritance clause. They needed me to suffer a tragic, fatal accident on that mountain. My murder was nothing more than a desperate financial bailout to keep the golden child out of a prison cell. A cold, hard realization settled deeply into my chest. Brenda was willing to sacrifice my actual life to save Chloe's social reputation. I stared at the glowing screen, watching the cursor blink steadily next to the massive sum of stolen money. I had the power to anonymously send this exact digital file directly to Todd's family right now. I could drop the bomb and watch Chloe lose her entire world before the sun even came up. But as I stared at the financial wreckage, I noticed another strange anomaly buried deep in Brenda's personal banking records. A large, estranged premium payment made to a major insurance conglomerate 6 months ago. My forensic instincts flared instantly. The embezzlement explained the urgent motive, but that specific premium payment hinted at something even darker hiding just beneath the surface. I leaned closer to the screen, completely ignoring the shooting pain in my arm, and prepared to pull the next thread. The glaring red flag in Brenda's checking account was a recurring monthly withdrawal of $480. It was routed directly to Vanguard National Life, a massive insurance conglomerate based out of Omaha. I stared at the glowing pixels on my laptop screen, forcing myself to completely ignore the sharp, stabbing pain radiating through my heavily bandaged ribs. As a forensic accountant, I have audited hundreds of personal and corporate portfolios. I know exactly how premium structures work. You do not pay premiums that high every single month unless you are aggressively insuring a massive, exceptionally high-value asset. My mother did not own any high-value assets. She lived in a heavily mortgaged suburban home and drove a leased mid-sized luxury sedan. So what exactly was she pouring nearly $500 a month into? My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Brenda was incredibly predictable when it came to her digital security. She used a simple variation of Chloe's birth year and our childhood street name for absolutely everything. I navigated directly to the Vanguard National Customer Portal, holding my breath as I typed in her credentials. The system authenticated immediately. My heart drummed a heavy, erratic beat against my breastbone as the welcome dashboard slowly loaded. I carefully clicked on the Active Policies tab, bracing myself for whatever financial secret she had buried here. The legal document that populated on my screen made the oxygen completely vanish from my sterile hospital room. It was a comprehensive term life insurance policy. My eyes scanned the bold black text at the top of the digital contract. The primary insured party listed on the first page was Sarah Elizabeth Miller, me. The total payout value in the specific event of an accidental death was $1.5 million. I felt a cold, clammy sweat break out across the back of my neck as I rapidly scrolled down to the beneficiary designation section. There was only one name listed on the entire document: Brenda Miller. She was legally entitled to 100% of the massive cash payout. My chest tightened painfully. I checked the exact date the policy was officially enacted. It was finalized and approved exactly 6 months ago. 6 full months. That timeline was an absolute revelation. 6 months ago was long before Chloe's massive corporate embezzlement scheme was on the verge of being discovered by her husband's family auditors. That meant the hiking trip was not just a sudden, desperate pivot to save her golden child from a federal prison sentence. Brenda had been actively betting on my premature death for half a year. She had planted the financial seeds of my demise while smiling at me across Sunday dinner tables and complaining about my boring lifestyle. My highly trained analytical brain immediately zeroed in on the strict logistics of the insurance industry. You cannot simply take out $1 million life insurance policy on another adult without their explicit, legally witnessed consent and a rigorous medical examination. I opened the appended digital files attached to the main policy, my uninjured hand trembling slightly over the laptop trackpad. I found a specialized waiver for the standard medical exam. Brenda had specifically opted for an expedited, no-questions-asked policy structure. It carried astronomical monthly premiums specifically because it completely bypassed the required doctor visits and blood panels. Then I found the electronic signature page. I pulled up the high-resolution scan and stared intently at the bottom line. It was my signature. The sweeping curve of the S and the sharp, distinctive loop of the H were practically flawless. It looked exactly like the way I signed my official audit reports. But I never signed that document. I had never spoken to anyone from Vanguard National Life. I zoomed in tightly on the digital ink, aggressively applying the forensic magnification tools I used daily to catch sophisticated corporate fraudsters. The truth revealed itself in the pixelation. It was a flawless digital composite. Brenda had taken an old joint tax return I had signed for her years ago, scanned it at a very high resolution, and meticulously traced my signature onto the insurance application. My own mother had deliberately committed felony forgery to place a $1.5 million bounty directly on my head. The sheer, unadulterated evil of it washed over my broken body like a physical wave of freezing water. Up until this exact moment, a tiny, pathetic part of my inner child had been desperately trying to rationalize her horrific actions on that mountain ledge. I had tried so incredibly hard to convince myself that Brenda was just a terrified mother pushed to the absolute brink, making a horrific split-second choice to sacrifice one daughter to keep her favorite child out of a federal penitentiary. I had almost tricked myself into believing her absolute worst sin was playing extreme, deadly favorites under immense pressure. But looking at this meticulously forged insurance policy, the brutal, undeniable truth finally shattered my very last remaining illusion. This was not a panicked, desperate rescue mission for Chloe. This was a highly calculated, dual-purpose slaughter. Brenda saw a brilliant opportunity to perfectly solve Chloe's $2.5 million embezzlement problem by securing my $4 million trust fund while simultaneously enriching herself with a massive tax-free cash payout. I was not a daughter to her. I was not a human being who had supported her for years. I was just a highly lucrative financial instrument waiting to be cashed in at the absolute perfect moment. The profound sadness that had weighed me down since the moment I hit the river water completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a sharp, crystal clear, and entirely ruthless focus. Brenda thought she had engineered the absolute perfect crime. She believed her boring, reliable daughter had vanished into the rapids, leaving behind nothing but a clear path to extraordinary wealth. But she had left behind a massive digital footprint, and she had completely forgotten what I do for a living. I closed the insurance portal and saved every single piece of evidence to my encrypted external drive. My mother wanted a tragic accident to fund her luxury retirement, but I was going to ensure she spent the rest of her natural life in a concrete cell. The harsh glow of my laptop screen eventually faded into the sterile morning light filtering through the secure hospital window. I had successfully isolated the raw data. I held the forged insurance documents and the clear digital trail of Chloe's massive corporate embezzlement safely on an encrypted drive. But raw data is completely useless if you do not possess the precise legal weapon to deploy it. I desperately needed a specialist. I looked at Detective Miller, who had just returned to my room carrying 2 bitter cups of black coffee. I told him I needed to make a highly secure, heavily encrypted phone call immediately. I needed Victoria Gallagher. Victoria was my late father's absolute most trusted estate attorney. She was a fierce, uncompromising woman in her late 60s who exclusively wore tailored wool suits and possessed a legal mind sharper than broken glass. My father had always told me that if the family finances ever caught on fire, Victoria was the single person I should trust to hold the fire extinguisher. Detective Miller quickly utilized his precinct resources to set up a clean, untraceable line. When Victoria answered, her voice was clipped and sharply professional, clearly expecting a routine legal inquiry from a detective. When I spoke my name, there was a stunned, heavy silence on the line. I did not waste time. I rapidly detailed everything: the treacherous cliff, the serrated knife, the forged life insurance policy, and the expedited death certificate Brenda was currently pushing through the local courts using her high society connections. Victoria did not offer me empty sympathetic platitudes or waste precious breath expressing her shock. She operated purely on aggressive legal strategy, which is exactly why I needed her on my side. She immediately pulled up my father's original massive trust documents from her secure firm archives. As she rapidly read through the specific contingency clauses, the true terrifying brilliance of my mother's plan became agonizingly clear. Victoria meticulously explained the legal loophole Brenda was actively exploiting while I lay battered in this anonymous bed. The trust was specifically designed to protect the $4 million until my 30th birthday. However, my father had insisted on including a standard mortality clause, just in case the unthinkable happened. If I were to suddenly pass away before coming of age, the trust would not simply dissolve. The massive capital would automatically default to the next of kin to prevent the state government from seizing the assets. Since Chloe was deliberately written out of the primary distribution due to her reckless spending habits, the default beneficiary was naturally my mother. Victoria confirmed my absolute worst fear. The very moment that local judge signs the preliminary death certificate, Brenda is fiercely lobbying for the bank, is legally obligated to unfreeze those accounts and hand my mother total unrestricted control of the $4 million. Raw panic flared, hot and sharp in my chest, completely overriding the dull throb of my fractured ribs. I told Victoria we had to stop the local magistrate immediately. We had to take the audio recording of the pocket dial directly to the judge and legally block the death certificate from being issued. I was ready to walk right into that courthouse, wrapped in bloody bandages, just to physically prove I was still breathing. But Victoria stopped me cold. Her voice coming through the encrypted speaker was calm, calculating, and absolutely chilling. She told me that revealing my survival right now would be a monumental tactical error. If we stopped Brenda today, she would only face an attempted murder charge. Victoria explained that attempted murder is notoriously difficult to prosecute when the only physical evidence is a frayed nylon rope and a highly subjective voicemail recorded in a windstorm. Brenda would immediately hire a massive team of high-priced, ruthless defense attorneys. She would confidently claim the rope snapped violently against the jagged rocks. She would claim the voicemail was completely taken out of context during a moment of extreme panic. She might even manipulate a sympathetic jury and walk entirely free. Then Victoria laid out the ultimate counter-strategy. It was a plan so ruthlessly brilliant, it made my forensic accountant heart race with pure adrenaline. We needed to let Brenda win the current battle. We needed to let her successfully obtain the fraudulent death certificate she was fighting so desperately for. We needed to stand quietly in the shadows and watch her eagerly submit the forged life insurance claim directly to Vanguard National Life. Victoria broke down the exact legal mechanics of the trap she was setting. Right now, Brenda is merely standing safely on the edge of a massive financial crime. We need her to willingly jump off. The precise moment she signs that massive insurance claim, under penalty of perjury, she commits felony insurance fraud. The exact moment that $1.5 million payout hits her bank account across state lines, it instantly becomes massive federal wire fraud. Federal crimes carry aggressive mandatory minimum sentencing. They completely bypass the local courts Brenda has influence over. More importantly, federal felonies trigger immediate devastating asset forfeiture. If we let her comfortably cash those illicit checks and officially transfer the $4 million trust into her personal accounts, the federal authorities will have the absolute undisputed power to completely seize everything she owns. I lay back against my firm hospital pillows, completely absorbing the sheer, staggering magnitude of what Victoria was proposing. It went against every single protective instinct in my body to sit in this sterile bed and allow the ruthless woman who tried to murder me to temporarily succeed. I would have to sit back and endure watching her parade around our hometown as a tragically grieving mother. I would have to watch her joyfully inherit the wealth my father had worked his entire life to diligently build. I would have to let her quietly pay off Chloe's massive embezzlement debts and celebrate their twisted, bloody victory. But I also knew Victoria was absolutely right. True justice is rarely about immediate emotional gratification. Real permanent justice requires immense ironclad patience. It requires giving the arrogant villain enough heavy rope to firmly and irreversibly hang themselves. I looked at the digital copy of the forged insurance policy still glowing brightly on my laptop screen. I thought about the cold, dead look in my mother's eyes as she dragged a serrated blade across my only lifeline. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial ruin and murder. I decided right then and there to let them dig their own graves so incredibly deep that they would never ever see the sunlight again. I told Victoria to prepare the necessary federal paperwork to freeze the assets the second the transfer cleared. The ghost was going to stay dead just a little bit longer. There is a very specific kind of freedom that comes with being legally dead. You no longer have a credit score to protect. You do not have an address to maintain or a morning commute to endure. You exist entirely outside the normal boundaries of society. For a forensic accountant, hunting her own murderers, that absolute invisibility is the greatest weapon imaginable. Safely hidden away in an undisclosed rehabilitation center, I spent the next week operating solely as a ghost in the digital machine. My shattered arm was still pinned in a heavy cast, and my ribs protested every time I leaned over my encrypted laptop. But the physical pain felt entirely irrelevant now. The initial sting of my mother's betrayal had completely hardened into a solid block of ice. I was no longer a grieving daughter mourning a family she never really had. I was an auditor, and I had found a massive discrepancy. It was finally time to balance the ledger. My primary target was not Brenda. Taking down my mother required waiting for her to commit federal insurance fraud, but Chloe was already deeply exposed. My golden sister had recklessly embezzled $2.5 million from her husband's family logistics empire. She had built her entire country club identity on stolen money and fragile lies. I knew Todd's father ran his company with an iron fist. He was a ruthless businessman who proudly boasted about his zero-tolerance policy for corporate theft. All he needed was a slight nudge in the right direction. I decided to give him a massive shove. Late on a Tuesday night, I routed my internet connection through 3 separate offshore servers to ensure absolute anonymity. I compiled a small but devastatingly precise package of financial evidence. I did not send them the entire puzzle. If I handed them the final answer, they might try to handle the situation quietly internally to save face. Instead, I sent them just enough breadcrumbs to spark a massive internal panic. I highlighted 3 specific dummy corporations Chloe had created. I flagged 12 suspicious sequential invoice numbers. I attached a simple, clean spreadsheet showing how those specific payments bypassed the standard vendor verification protocols. I drafted a short, anonymous email addressed directly to the senior compliance officer at Todd's family firm. The subject line simply read, "Potential vendor fraud and internal embezzlement." I hit send and watched the digital packet fly off into cyberspace. The fallout was beautifully immediate. Because I had previously embedded digital tripwires in the backend of the family accounts I used to manage, I could actively monitor the network traffic. By Wednesday morning, the internal servers at Todd's company experienced a massive surge in activity. Digital tracking addresses linked to their senior executive team and their external auditing firm began pulling years of old payment records. They were initiating a silent emergency audit. The trap had successfully snapped shut. Todd and his father were quietly hunting a massive thief inside their own house, and Chloe had absolutely no idea that her pristine, fraudulent world was about to violently collapse. It took exactly 48 hours for the crushing reality to hit my sister. I knew the exact moment the corporate news began to tighten, because I had retained backdoor access to Chloe's personal email account. She was just as lazy with her digital security as my mother. Sitting in my quiet hospital room, I watched my screen refresh as a chaotic flurry of desperate messages began flying back and forth between Chloe and Brenda. The tone of Chloe's emails shifted rapidly from her usual arrogant country club complaints to absolute frantic hysteria. Her first message to Brenda arrived late Thursday afternoon. She wrote that Brenda needed to call her right now. Todd had asked her a bunch of really weird questions about the accounts payable department that day. He wanted to know if she recognized a specific vendor name. His dad had independent auditors crawling all over the corporate office, and nobody would tell her why. She thought they were looking into the shipping invoices. She was totally freaking out and demanded a phone call the second Brenda saw the message. Brenda replied 20 minutes later, urging her golden child to simply calm down and play dumb. She told Chloe to go to her spa appointment and act completely normal, but Chloe was far past the point of rational behavior. The offshore loan sharks were likely breathing down her neck for their monthly extortion payments, and now her husband was actively investigating the exact fake companies she used to steal his family wealth. Her next email to our mother was a frantic, breathless demand that laid their entire murderous conspiracy completely bare. Chloe typed her words, practically bleeding terror through the glowing screen. She told Brenda that she did not understand the gravity of the situation. They were doing a full forensic sweep. They were going to find the shell accounts by next week. If Todd found out she took that money, he would absolutely destroy her. He would take the house, he would take the cars, and his father would press federal charges. She was going to end up in a prison cell. She begged Brenda to hurry up with the death payout. She reminded Brenda of a promise that this would be resolved quickly. Brenda had said the insurance money and my trust fund would be cleared by now. Chloe desperately needed that cash to quietly replace the missing corporate funds before the auditors traced the routing numbers back to her. She demanded Brenda call the insurance company and make them expedite the wire transfer. She told Brenda to play the grieving mother and demand the money right now. She finished the email, begging her mother to fix this, because she had promised she would fix this. I sat back and slowly exhaled, reading that final desperate paragraph over and over again. My own sister was angrily demanding the immediate payout for my murder so she could cover up her sloppy corporate theft. There was not a single syllable of remorse for my supposed death. There was no grief for the sister who had plummeted off a mountain. There was only raw selfish terror about getting caught. They were two cornered animals aggressively turning on each other. As the walls closed in, I closed my laptop and smiled in the dark, quiet room. The silent audit was officially tearing Chloe's life apart, and Brenda was about to do something incredibly reckless to save her. The storm outside my secure hospital window had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, unforgiving morning light that perfectly matched the absolute clarity in my mind. Detective Miller arrived just before 8 o'clock, carrying a thick manila folder and a steaming cup of terrible cafeteria coffee. He did not look like a local investigator handling a tragic wilderness accident anymore. He looked exactly like a seasoned hunter who had finally cornered his prey. Sitting on the edge of the vinyl visitor chair, he laid out the strict final parameters of our covert sting operation. The federal authorities were now fully involved, directly coordinating with the Internal Fraud Division at Vanguard National Life. We were going to let my mother completely win. We were going to let her feel the intoxicating rush of unearned wealth right before we slammed the iron bars of a federal penitentiary shut around her forever. The trap required immense precision and absolute patience. Brenda had aggressively pushed the local magistrate, leveraging every single ounce of her country club sympathy, and miraculously secured the preliminary death certificate. As soon as she held that official piece of paper, she wasted absolutely no time. Detective Miller confirmed that she had immediately submitted the formal claim for the $1.5 million life insurance policy, signing her name electronically under penalty of perjury. That single digital signature was the exact moment she crossed the point of no return. It was no longer just a local attempted murder investigation. By utilizing the internet to file a deeply fraudulent financial claim across state lines, my mother had officially committed massive federal wire fraud. The insurance company, fully briefed by the FBI, played their designated role perfectly. Instead of raising the standard red flags or triggering an intensive review process, which would happen in any normal high-dollar claim, they sent Brenda a highly official, perfectly tailored email of approval. They expressed their deepest manufactured condolences for the tragic, untimely loss of her beloved daughter and confirmed that the massive funds would be instantly expedited. The payout was scheduled to be wired directly into her personal checking account by 5 o'clock that very evening. I lay in my sterile bed, staring at the blank ceiling tiles, tracking the agonizing hours as they slowly ticked by. Every passing minute felt like a heavy physical weight pressing down on my shattered ribs. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how a wire transfer moved through the Federal Reserve Network. I pictured the digital currency flowing silently from Omaha directly to Brenda's local suburban bank branch. $1,500,000. That was the exact calculated price tag my own mother had confidently placed on my life. By late afternoon, the tension in the room was suffocating. Detective Miller returned carrying a secure encrypted tablet. The federal authorities had quietly obtained a rapid warrant to tap my mother's cell phone, knowing with absolute certainty she would immediately reach out to her co-conspirator the second the stolen money cleared. Miller handed me a pair of heavy black headphones. His expression was grim, serving as a silent warning to brace myself for the profound cruelty I was about to hear. I slipped the heavy padded headphones over my ears and waited in the quiet darkness of my room. At exactly 5:15, the audio feed crackled to life. It was Brenda calling Chloe. The ringing tone echoed sharply in my ears until my sister finally answered. Chloe sounded completely breathless, her voice tight with the frantic, ragged panic of a woman desperately trying to outrun a team of massive corporate auditors. She immediately demanded to know if the process was done. My mother's voice flowed smoothly through the encrypted connection, dripping with pure, unadulterated triumph. She told Chloe to take a deep breath, to pour herself a large drink, and to completely stop worrying. The wire transfer had just posted to the account. The money was sitting securely in her absolute control. I could actually hear the distinctive crystal-clear clink of two champagne flutes meeting in a celebratory toast on Brenda's end of the line. She was not just relieved by the payout. She was completely euphoric. Then my mother casually said the words that entirely extinguished any lingering spark of daughterly affection I still harbored deep in my bruised heart. She took a slow sip of her champagne and sighed lightly, telling Chloe that while the whole messy ordeal on the hiking trail was terribly unpleasant, it truly was for the best. She told my sister that I was always far too rigid, too relentlessly boring, and completely incapable of understanding how the real privileged world operated. She boldly declared that my sudden tragic departure was actually a massive blessing in disguise, because now that ridiculous $4 million trust fund was completely unlocked, and they never had to worry about my stingy financial lectures ever again. Chloe laughed a sharp, ugly sound that made my blood run absolutely cold. She enthusiastically agreed with our mother, adding that she would use the massive insurance payout to immediately cover the missing embezzled funds at Todd's logistics firm before the external auditors ever found her hidden dummy corporations. My own sister actually called my brutal murder the perfect ultimate severance package. I slowly pulled the headphones off, letting them fall heavily onto the sterile hospital blankets. The sheer breathtaking callousness of their private conversation did not make me cry. It did not break my heart or send me spiraling into a deep pit of grief. It completely and permanently galvanized me. They were toasting my violent death with expensive champagne, treating my entire existence as nothing more than a temporary, annoying obstacle they had finally managed to permanently swat away. I looked directly at Detective Miller, my uninjured hand curling into a tight, solid fist. There would be absolutely no mercy going forward. The trap was perfectly set. The irresistible bait was fully taken, and the federal hammer was about to fall with devastating absolute force. The scent of high-priced lilies and heavy, expensive perfume filled the grand ballroom of the Pinecrest Country Club. It was a beautiful, sunlit Saturday afternoon in our wealthy suburban town, but inside that building, the atmosphere was intentionally crafted to feel like a deeply somber, tragic masterpiece. My mother, Brenda, had officially organized a massive, lavish memorial service to publicly mourn my tragic, untimely passing. To the outer world, this grand event was a broken-hearted mother's ultimate tribute to her reliable daughter, who had supposedly perished in a horrific hiking accident. But lying in my quiet, secure rehabilitation bed miles away, watching the live high-definition stream on my laptop screen, I saw the reality with absolute precision. This spectacular event was not a funeral. It was a ruthlessly calculated public relations stunt, completely and entirely financed by the $1.5 million life insurance payout she had just stolen using my forged signature. Brenda had pulled out absolutely all the stops for this performance. She hired a prominent event decorator from the city to transform the exclusive ballroom into a sweeping ocean of white velvet drapery, crystal candles, and towering arrangements of rare white orchids. The guest list reads like a definitive who is who of the local banking corporate and country club elite. Every single prominent family in our social circle had received an elegant hand-engraved invitation wrapped beautifully in black silk ribbon. But the most crucial attendees sat dead center in the front VIP row. It was Todd's family, the immensely powerful traditional owners of the massive logistics conglomerate Chloe had systematically embezzled millions of dollars from. Brenda was not standing at that polished marble podium to simply shed maternal tears for me. She was actively using my supposed death as a strategic emotional shield to protect her golden child from imminent financial ruin and a lengthy federal prison sentence. She knew with absolute certainty that Todd's father was closing in on Chloe's network of fake dummy corporations. She knew the corporate auditors were mere days away from discovering the staggering $2.5 million discrepancy in the company accounts payable department. This extravagant memorial was a desperate preemptive strike. Brenda was boldly gambling that if she painted our family in deep, unspeakable tragedy, Todd's ruthless father would hesitate to press wire fraud charges out of pure societal pity. She wanted to make it completely impossible for them to legally destroy Chloe without looking like absolute monsters who kicked a grieving family while they were down. Through the clear lens of the club's broadcast camera, I watched my mother smoothly glide toward the center stage. She wore a stunning custom designer black silk gown that fitted her meticulously draped in my late father's expensive string of vintage pearls. Her hair was coiffed to absolute perfection, and her makeup was artfully done to look slightly washed out, as if she had spent sleepless nights weeping over her terrible loss. She moved with an intentional heavy frailty, gripping Chloe's arm with a tight performative desperation. Chloe played her designated part flawlessly, wearing an oversized black veil that shielded her eyes from the crowd, occasionally letting out a quiet, dramatic sob into a lace handkerchief. They looked exactly like a family broken by sudden disaster. Brenda leaned into the silver microphone, her voice amplified beautifully across the silent room. Her opening words carried a practiced trembling cadence that completely captivated the hundreds of wealthy onlookers. My precious daughter Sarah was a quiet, private soul. She whispered, her hand resting mournfully over her chest. She was always so focused on her practical financial accounting work, always looking out for the stability of this family. Losing her on that terrible, slick mountain trail has completely shattered my heart into a million pieces. But looking out at all of your beautiful, supportive faces today, I know her memory will live on through the love we share. A visible wave of collective sympathy rippled immediately through the crowded ballroom. I saw several prominent country club matrons dab away real tears with their tissues. Todd's father sat perfectly rigid, his stern, unreadable expression softening just a fraction as he watched my mother tremble beneath the bright stage lights. Todd wrapped a comforting arm around Chloe's slouched shoulders, completely oblivious to the fact that his beautiful, adoring wife had stolen millions from his family legacy, and that his mother-in-law had calmly sliced through a climbing rope to finance the cover-up. The absolute callousness of the spectacle made my pulse race with a cold, lethal focus. They were standing in a room that cost tens of thousands of dollars to rent, sipping premium champagne, and eating catered hors d'oeuvres entirely funded by blood money. They were aggressively using my name, my history, and my manufactured demise to buy themselves social capital and legal immunity. Brenda had managed to transform my attempted murder into her absolute highest social triumph. She was basking openly in the heavy spotlight of tragic martyrdom, using the stolen insurance wire transfer to solidify her high society status once and for all. I leaned closer to my hospital laptop screen, my good hand tightening into a solid vice around the edge of the keyboard. There was absolutely no grief in that grand ballroom. There was only raw, cold calculation disguised as maternal love. Brenda believed she had successfully buried me beneath a mountain of shale and an ocean of white lilies. She believed that by cashing that forged policy and staging this brilliant performance, she had effectively saved Chloe from an orange jumpsuit and secured her own luxurious retirement. They truly believed the ghost would remain quietly at the bottom of the river gorge while they passed the collection plate of public sympathy. But they had no idea that Detective Miller was currently standing discreetly at the back of that very ballroom, dressed in a plain civilian suit. They had absolutely no clue that federal fraud investigators were quietly monitoring every single asset transfer Brenda was making from her personal checking account. Every dime she spent on that country club rental, every check she signed for the caterers, was a fresh piece of concrete evidence pinning her to federal wire fraud. I watched my mother smile weakly at Todd's father, accepting his solemn condolences with a graceful, tragic nod. "Enjoy your beautiful performance, Mother," I thought to myself as the screen refreshed with a new confirmation message from my attorney, Victoria Gallagher. "Drink your expensive champagne and soak in every single ounce of pity you can muster. Because the federal hammer is officially moving into position, and I am going to make absolutely sure you enjoy your very last afternoon of freedom." The crisp morning air hit my face like a heavy bucket of freezing water as the automatic glass doors of the private medical facility finally slid open. For several agonizing weeks, I had known absolutely nothing but sterile white walls, the rhythmic electronic hum of cardiac monitors, and the overwhelming sharp scent of industrial antiseptic. Stepping out onto the sunlit concrete pavement felt like crossing a massive invisible threshold between two entirely different worlds. I was no longer a nameless phantom hiding away in the quiet shadows of a secure ward. I was Sarah Elizabeth Miller, stepping firmly back into the land of the living. I moved toward the waiting vehicle with a pronounced methodical slowness. My right arm was heavily secured in a rigid black medical brace, hugging tightly against my chest to prevent any sudden jarring movements. Every single time I placed weight on my left leg, a sharp electrical spike of protest shot directly up from my fractured ribs, causing a noticeable awkward limp. I was undeniably battered, covered in deep purple contusions and healing lacerations that mapped the brutal, violent story of my fall. But I was breathing. I was standing on my own 2 feet. Detective Miller had coordinated with a trusted colleague to quietly retrieve a few specific items from my apartment earlier that week. I absolutely refused to confront my mother wearing standard-issue hospital scrubs or shapeless grey sweatpants. I needed proper armor for the battlefield ahead. I had carefully slipped my good arm into a sharp, meticulously tailored black wool suit. It was the exact suit I typically wore to high-stakes corporate audits when I needed to project absolute unyielding authority and demand strict accountability. Looking at my pale, bruised reflection in the tinted window of the unmarked police cruiser, I realized the profound, bitter irony of my wardrobe choice. I was wearing traditional mourning attire to my very own elaborate memorial service, but I was definitely not the one who was about to be buried. Inside the spacious back cabin of the mobile command unit parked discreetly down the street from the Pinecrest Country Club, the atmosphere was electric with intense calculating energy. Detective Miller sat directly across from me, tapping his pen rhythmically against his knee. Next to him sat Victoria Gallagher, looking exactly like a lethal apex predator ready to strike. The fierce estate attorney had a thick, pristine binder resting on her lap, containing every single piece of federal documentation we had spent the last week quietly assembling. The binder held the wire transfer logs, the fraudulent insurance claims, and the heavy asset forfeiture warrants authorized by a federal judge just hours ago. Victoria laid out the final choreography of our sting operation with absolute surgical precision. She explained that federal agents were currently positioned at every single exit of the country club ballroom, dressed flawlessly as standard event staff and valid attendance. They were waiting for one specific legal trigger. We could not simply walk in and disrupt the polite cocktail hour. We needed Brenda to firmly and publicly establish her fraudulent narrative in front of hundreds of prominent, wealthy witnesses. We needed her to stand at that expensive marble microphone and weave her intricate web of lies directly into the permanent legal record. Detective Miller pointed to a live audio feed coming from a tiny, discreet microphone planted near the main stage by an undercover agent. He explained that the official event schedule dictated a brief welcome reception, followed immediately by a seated tribute. Brenda was slated to deliver the primary emotional eulogy exactly 30 minutes into the program. That was our designated narrow window of opportunity. The detective looked me dead in the eye and asked if I was physically and mentally prepared for the sheer magnitude of what was about to happen. He warned me that stepping through those heavy oak doors would ignite a catastrophic public explosion that my family would never ever recover from. I looked down at my braced arm and thought about the freezing, rushing water of the river gorge. I thought about the utterly terrifying moment I realized my own mother had intentionally orchestrated my brutal death just to cover up my sister's massive corporate crimes. I felt absolutely no hesitation and no lingering warmth. I told him I had already lost my family, the exact second Brenda dragged that serrated tactical blade across my climbing rope. Today was not about preserving a toxic family unit. Today was strictly about balancing a profoundly fraudulent ledger and holding a murderer accountable. The heavy black SUV slowly rolled up the manicured, winding driveway of the Pinecrest Country Club. The sprawling, pristine lawns and massive stone pillars looked exactly as they always did, projecting an aura of immense exclusive wealth and untouchable social privilege. Through the dark-tinted windows, I watched oblivious high society guests arriving in expensive luxury vehicles, blindly handing their keys to the undercover federal agents posing as friendly valets. We bypassed the grand main lobby entirely and parked near the discreet catering entrance in the back. The three of us stood quietly in the dimly lit service corridor just behind the massive ballroom. The air back there smelled strongly of roasted duck and expensive, rare floral arrangements. Through the thick velvet curtains separating us from the main event, I could hear the low, refined murmur of hundreds of wealthy guests. I could hear the soft, somber notes of a string quartet playing a beautiful classical piece. It was a perfectly designed atmosphere of tragic sorrow, completely manufactured by a woman who felt absolutely none. Victoria checked her gold wristwatch, mirroring my own internal countdown. She nodded sharply to Detective Miller, who quietly unclipped the heavy tactical radio from his belt. We stood together in the shadows, listening intently to the live audio feed. The gentle classical music slowly faded out. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the massive ballroom. Then I heard the sharp, distinctive tap of a manicured finger against a microphone. I heard my mother clear her throat, preparing to deliver the performance of a lifetime. I squared my shoulders completely, ignoring the sharp burning pain in my ribs, and stepped directly toward the heavy oak doors. It was officially time for a resurrection. Standing in the dimly lit service corridor of the Pinecrest Country Club, I could smell the overpowering fragrance of rare white orchids. It was a suffocatingly sweet scent, carefully chosen by high-end event planners, designed specifically to mask the absolute rot hiding underneath this entire charade. My breath hitched slightly, pulling sharply against my fractured ribs, but I forced myself to stand perfectly straight. My right arm was tightly bound in a heavy black medical brace, pressing securely against the crisp fabric of my tailored wool suit. I was not wearing the soft pastel colors my mother always tried to force on me to make me look compliant. I was wearing the exact sharp black armor I wore when I walked into hostile corporate boardrooms to forcefully dismantle complex financial frauds. Today, the massive fraud I was dismantling just happened to be my own mother. Flanking me in the quiet shadows of the hallway were the two specific people who had helped me engineer this precise moment. Detective Miller stood to my left, radiating the calm, tense energy of a veteran cop about to close a career-defining case. To my right stood Victoria Gallagher, my late father's fiercely brilliant estate attorney, clutching a thick leather binder filled with devastating federal asset forfeiture warrants. We were the absolute worst nightmare Brenda and Chloe could ever possibly imagine, and we were standing less than 20 feet away from their moment of ultimate public triumph. Through the narrow gap in the heavy velvet curtains separating the service hall from the grand ballroom, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the extravagant spectacle. Brenda had spared absolutely no expense, using the $1.5 million she had fraudulently wired from Vanguard National Life just days ago. The room was packed with hundreds of wealthy guests sitting quietly in rows of gilded chairs. I recognized the local bank presidents, the real estate developers, and the country club elite. Sitting squarely in the front row was Todd and his deeply conservative, incredibly powerful parents. They were the true primary target audience for this lavish emotional production. Chloe sat closely beside her husband, hiding her face behind dark designer sunglasses, acting the part of the completely devastated sister. She desperately needed Todd's family to feel so overwhelmed with public pity that they would completely overlook the $2.5 million she had systematically embezzled from their corporate accounts. It was a masterful class in emotional manipulation, funded entirely by the premium placed on my life. A soft, mournful melody from a live string quartet drifted smoothly through the air as Brenda slowly approached the polished marble podium. The classical music was perfectly timed, designed to pull sharply at the heartstrings of every single wealthy donor sitting in that room. Brenda stepped up to the microphone, wearing a custom black silk dress and my father's absolute favorite string of vintage pearls. She reached up with a trembling hand, dabbing the corners of her perfectly dry eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief. She looked out over the vast sea of sympathetic faces and took a deep, shuddering breath that echoed heavily through the massive ballroom speakers. "Thank you all for being here today to honor my sweet, beautiful Sarah." Brenda began, her voice quivering with perfect, practiced theatrical grief. "As a mother, you always hope you can protect your children from the harsh, brutal realities of this world. But Sarah was always so fragile, so clumsy. She never quite found her footing in life the way other young women do. She preferred her quiet little spreadsheets to the vibrant, beautiful world outside. But I loved her. I loved her with every single fiber of my being. A collective sympathetic murmur rippled immediately through the wealthy audience. I felt a surge of pure, fiery adrenaline push past the dull, throbbing ache of my broken bones. She was standing up there, boldly portraying me as a weak, pathetic shut-in who had clumsily stumbled to her own tragic demise. She was actively rewriting my entire 29 years of independent existence to flawlessly fit her twisted narrative of the tragic, helpless daughter. When we were up on that mountain, Brenda continued, her voice breaking perfectly on cue. I tried so incredibly hard to save her. I reached out over that terrible cliff. I would have gladly traded my own life to pull my fragile girl back to safety. But she slipped right through my fingers. My clumsy, sweet Sarah is gone, and our family will never, ever be the same. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sob from the front row, leaning heavily into Todd's chest. Brenda wiped her dry eyes again, looking directly down at Todd's parents with a brave, tragic smile. "All we have left now is family," she whispered softly into the microphone. "We must fiercely protect the family we have left." That was the exact cue I had been waiting for. She had publicly, firmly, and legally committed to her fraudulent narrative in front of hundreds of witnesses and a dozen undercover federal agents posing as valid staff outside. I looked at Detective Miller and gave a single sharp nod. He reached forward and firmly grabbed the brass handle of the left oak door while Victoria gripped the right. With a sudden, violent thrust, they shoved the massive, heavy oak doors completely open. The thick wood slammed aggressively against the interior walls of the ballroom with a loud, echoing crack that sounded exactly like a gunshot. The mournful music from the string quartet screeched to a sudden, chaotic halt as the cellist dropped his bow in pure shock. Every single head in that packed grand ballroom whipped around simultaneously to face the back entrance. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the bright, brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers. I did not try to hide my pronounced limp. I did not try to hide the dark purple bruises blooming across my pale face, or the heavy black medical brace strapping my shattered arm tightly to my chest. I walked straight down the center aisle of the quiet ballroom with my head held extremely high, flanked by a decorated police detective and a ruthless estate attorney. The thick, suffocating silence in the room was absolute. It was the distinct sound of a carefully constructed reality violently crashing to the floor. I kept my eyes locked dead center on the marble podium. Brenda stood completely frozen behind the microphone. The delicate lace handkerchief slipped directly out of her hand and fluttered slowly down to the polished floor. The color drained out of her face so incredibly fast, she looked exactly like a wax statue rapidly melting under the stage lights. Her mouth fell completely open, unable to form a single syllable of her carefully rehearsed script. In the front row, Chloe slowly pulled down her dark designer sunglasses, her eyes bulging in sheer, unadulterated terror. Todd and his powerful parents stared at me as if a literal ghost had just marched through the heavy doors. I stopped exactly 10 feet away from the front stage, staring directly up at the woman who had tried to murder me for a financial payout. I was not clumsy, I was not fragile, and I was completely, entirely done playing dead. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was heavy enough to crush bone. I stood at the end of the long center aisle, watching the exact moment my mother realized her entire perfectly constructed universe was collapsing. The color drained from Brenda's face so rapidly, she looked as though she had been turned to solid chalk. She gripped the edges of the polished marble podium with white-knuckled desperation, leaning heavily against it, as if her legs had suddenly completely forgotten how to support her weight. Her jaw worked soundlessly, opening and closing without producing a single syllable. Off to the side in the front row, the perfectly orchestrated illusion of my sister's grief also violently shattered. Chloe had been holding a delicate crystal flute of premium champagne poised perfectly for a toast to my tragic memory. When she saw me standing there, the expensive glass slipped directly through her trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, piercing crash. That singular loud sound of shattering crystal echoed across the massive room, completely breaking the spell that had frozen the 150 high society guests in their seats. I began to walk forward. Every single step I took sent a harsh spike of agonizing pain radiating up from my fractured ribs, but I did not let a single wince cross my face. My heavy black medical brace secured my shattered arm tightly against my tailored wool suit, serving as an undeniable physical testament to the brutal reality of what had actually happened on that mountain. Detective Miller and Victoria Gallagher walked slowly and deliberately right behind me, serving as an impenetrable wall of legal and federal authority. The elite crowd parted instinctively, pulling their chairs back and staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, as if they were watching an actual corpse march straight out of an open grave. I saw Todd's powerful parents staring in utter disbelief. I saw the wealthy country club matrons clutching their own pearls. I did not look at any of them. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the woman standing frozen at the podium. Brenda looked absolutely terrified. Her eyes were completely wide and darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that simply did not exist. As I finally reached the front of the stage, I climbed the 3 short steps with methodical precision. My mother shrank back, physically recoiling from me, as if my very presence burned her. She was hyperventilating now, her chest heaving violently beneath the expensive black silk dress she had bought with my stolen life insurance payout. I stepped right up into her personal space. The heavy scent of her expensive perfume made me want to retch, but I kept my posture rigidly straight. I reached out with my uninjured hand and firmly wrapped my fingers around the sleek silver microphone. Brenda was completely paralyzed. She did not even attempt to stop me as I smoothly slid the microphone directly out of her rigid grasp. I turned to face the vast sea of pale, shocked faces. I did not yell. I did not scream or cry. I kept my voice perfectly, chillingly calm. "You look surprised, Mum," I said, the amplified sound of my voice rolling smoothly over the massive crowd. "Didn't you say I was always good at bouncing back?" A collective gasp rippled rapidly through the expensive ballroom. Brenda let out a pathetic, choked whimper and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own designer heels. She covered her mouth with both hands, shaking uncontrollably. I looked out at the 150 prominent guests who had just spent the last hour weeping over my supposed tragic demise. "I am so incredibly sorry to interrupt this beautiful, lavish memorial service," I continued, my tone laced with a sharp, freezing courtesy. "I know you all came here today to mourn a tragic hiking accident. I know my mother just stood exactly where I am standing right now and delivered a heartbreaking, beautiful speech about how incredibly fragile and clumsy I always was. She told you I slipped. She told you she reached out desperately to save me." I turned my head slightly to look directly at my mother. Brenda was crying now, but they were absolutely not tears of maternal relief. They were the ugly, panicked tears of a cornered criminal realizing her flawless performance was permanently over. "But we all know the absolute truth, do we not, Mother?" I asked quietly, but the microphone picked up every single devastating syllable. "You did not reach out to save me on that cliff. You specifically chose the deadliest drop on the entire mountain trail. You deliberately packed a tactical serrated survival knife in your bag. And when I reached out to pull you to safety, you intentionally severed my climbing rope and watched me fall 70 feet into a freezing rocky river gorge." The ballroom erupted into absolute total chaos. Several women actually screamed out loud. Todd jumped entirely out of his seat, his face red with sudden confusion and rising anger, looking frantically from me down to Chloe. My sister was curled into a tight, pathetic ball in her chair, weeping hysterically with her face buried in her hands, completely unable to look at her husband or his furious, powerful parents. I raised my good hand, demanding and receiving immediate total silence from the stunned crowd. "You might be wondering why a loving mother would do something so incredibly barbaric," I said, keeping my forensic focus entirely on the facts. "It is actually quite simple. It always comes down to the math. Exactly 6 months ago, Brenda secretly took out a massive $1.5 million life insurance policy on my life. She completely bypassed the required medical exams, and she committed felony forgery by tracing my signature onto the digital application." I paused, letting the staggering financial reality sink deeply into the minds of the wealthy bankers and real estate developers sitting before me. But the insurance fraud was just a wonderful, lucrative bonus. I continued, my eyes locking directly onto Todd's father in the front row. The real absolute motive was my $4 million trust fund. "You see, my sister Chloe has a very expensive secret. She has not been living off her husband's wealth. For the past 2 years, Chloe has been systematically funneling money into 3 separate offshore dummy corporations. She has embezzled exactly $2.5 million from her husband's family logistics company to pay off massive debts to predatory loan sharks. Todd let out a loud, furious shout, spinning around and grabbing Chloe by the shoulder. She completely collapsed onto the floor, sobbing, begging him to listen to her, but the damage was utterly irreversible. Todd's father stood up, his face an absolute mask of pure, unadulterated corporate fury, staring down at the weeping woman who had stolen his family legacy. My mother needed my trust fund to quietly replace the stolen corporate money before your internal auditors discovered the massive theft next month, I said, speaking directly to Todd's family now. And because I was the strict trustee who would never ever allow that illegal transfer, she decided the only available option was to murder me in the wilderness and trigger the default inheritance clause. I turned back to look at Brenda one last time. She was completely broken, utterly destroyed by the exact weapon I had spent my entire life perfecting. The unvarnished, undeniable truth. So please, I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the massive silent hall, do not let me stop the proceedings. Let us continue to mourn. But today, we are not mourning a clumsy daughter who fell off a mountain. Today, we are mourning the absolute permanent death of your incredibly expensive, perfect, fraudulent facade. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. It was the kind of profound, heavy quiet that only occurs when a perfectly constructed lie is brutally exposed to the harsh light of reality. I stood on the raised stage of the Pinecrest Country Club, looking down at the sea of wealthy, powerful faces. These were the elite members of our suburban society, the bankers and socialites who had gathered to sip premium wine and weep over my tragic demise. They were completely paralyzed in their gilded chairs. Behind me, Brenda remained frozen at the marble podium. I did not need to raise my voice or scream to demand their attention. I had already dismantled her carefully rehearsed performance, using nothing but the cold, hard, undeniable truth. Anger implies a sudden loss of emotional control. I had never been more in control of my entire life than in this exact second. I turned my back on my mother, leaving her trapped under the blinding glare of the stage lights. Every single movement I made required immense physical calculation. My fractured ribs burned with a deep, agonizing fire, and my heavy black medical brace kept my right arm securely pinned to my chest. I slowly descended the short carpeted steps leading down from the stage. The guests sitting in the front rows instinctively leaned back as I approached. They looked at my pale, bruised face and my tailored black suit with a mixture of raw terror and morbid fascination. But I ignored the murmuring crowd entirely. My focus was locked directly on the center of the VIP section, where Todd and his incredibly powerful parents were seated. Todd's father was a man who had built a massive international logistics empire through ruthless business acumen and strict corporate discipline. He commanded total respect and demanded absolute loyalty from everyone in his orbit. Sitting right next to him was Todd, a man who had blindly trusted his beautiful, charming wife with the keys to his family wealth. Todd looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. His handsome face was contorted with a frantic, desperate confusion. He looked exactly like a drowning man searching for a life raft in the middle of a violent ocean storm. But I had absolutely no intention of throwing him a rope. I was there to hand him an incredibly heavy anchor. Victoria Gallagher. My brilliant estate attorney stepped out from the shadows near the front row. She moved with the silent, predatory grace of a woman who destroyed massive corporate frauds for a living. She held out a thick, heavily reinforced manila folder. I reached out with my uninjured left hand and grasped the envelope. The physical weight of the paper was deeply satisfying. It contained weeks of painstaking forensic accounting, digital wire transfer logs, bank statements, and undeniable proof of a massive financial crime. It was the exact ammunition I needed to completely destroy the false reality my sister had built. I stopped directly in front of Todd. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in erratic, panicked rhythms. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see what the ghost standing before them was going to do next. I extended my left arm out, holding the manila folder steady. Before we mourn my clumsiness, Todd, I said, keeping my voice perfectly chillingly calm, you should look at page 3. It details exactly how your wife embezzled $2.5 million from your firm. Todd hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hands trembling violently. Then he reached out and took the folder. The sharp sound of the heavy paper rustling echoed loudly in the silent room. He flipped past the executive summary and the initial banking records, going straight to the third page, just as I had instructed. I stood there and watched the visceral physical reaction wash over him. First, a deep, angry crimson red flushed rapidly up his neck and flooded his cheeks as the initial shock hit his system. He was staring directly at a neatly organized spreadsheet showing his own corporate funds being quietly siphoned away. As his eyes tracked down the columns, his face underwent a drastic, terrifying transformation. The flush of hot, angry color vanished, entirely replaced by a sickly, translucent chalk white. He was looking at the specific dates, the exact routing numbers, and the names of 3 offshore dummy corporations. He recognized the fake vendor accounts because he had unknowingly approved the payment invoices himself. Todd was looking at the undeniable mathematical proof that the woman sitting right next to him had systematically robbed his family blind to pay off her own massive personal debts. His father leaned over his shoulder, his piercing gray eyes scanning the financial data. The older man let out a low, sharp breath that sounded exactly like a physical blow. Suddenly, the spell of shock was broken by a piercing, desperate shriek. Chloe snapped out of her pathetic weeping and completely lost her mind. She lunged forward from her seat, her perfectly manicured hands clawing frantically at the air. She tried violently to grab the manila folder directly out of her husband's hands. She screamed at the top of her lungs that I was lying. Her voice bounced wildly off the expensive crystal chandeliers, echoing with raw, unhinged panic. She shrieked that the documents were completely fabricated, that they were forged by a jealous, bitter sister who simply wanted to ruin her perfect marriage. She sobbed and wailed, begging Todd not to look at the paper, pleading with him to trust her. Todd did not look at her. He did not say a single comforting word or try to calm her down. His eyes remained locked firmly on the damning numbers printed on the page in his hands. As Chloe lunged forward a second time, grasping desperately at his tailored suit jacket, Todd simply raised his arm. With a look of absolute profound disgust twisting his handsome features, he forcefully pushed his wife away. It was a harsh, decisive physical rejection. Chloe stumbled backward off balance. Her expensive designer heels caught on the edge of the thick carpet, and she collapsed heavily onto the floor. She sat there in her lavish black morning dress, weeping hysterically, while the entire country club elite watched the absolute destruction of her pristine, fraudulent life. The truth was finally out in the open, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. The sheer audacity of a cornered predator is a truly terrifying thing to witness. I stood there at the front of the lavish ballroom, watching the initial shock wash off my mother and rapidly transform into a fierce, calculating desperation. For a fraction of a second, Brenda had been completely paralyzed by the undeniable truth laid bare in front of Todd and his wealthy family. The absolute destruction of Chloe's financial lies had shaken the room to its core. But my mother had spent her entire adult life charming her way out of severe consequences and navigating the treacherous waters of elite social circles. Her survival instinct kicked into massive overdrive. She let go of the marble podium and took 2 swift steps toward me, throwing her hands up in a gesture of profound theatrical anguish. She completely ignored the devastating financial documents currently burning a hole in Todd's hands. Instead, she focused her intense gaze entirely on the bewildered crowd, actively attempting to twist the narrative right back into her favor. "Please, everyone, you must understand," she cried out, her voice vibrating with a masterfully feigned maternal sorrow that echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings. "Look at my poor, sweet girl. Look at what she has been through. She has survived an unimaginable physical and emotional trauma. She fell off a terrible cliff in the middle of a wilderness storm. It was a horrible, tragic accident. The doctors warned me this might happen if she ever woke up. They explicitly told me that severe head injuries and intense psychological shock could cause aggressive hallucinations and deep paranoid delusions." The murmurs in the grand ballroom shifted immediately. I could actually see the thick, heavy doubt creeping back into the eyes of the country club elite. Brenda was an absolute master of gaslighting, and she was playing her greatest hit to an audience that desperately wanted to avoid an ugly high society scandal. The wealthy bankers and their wives exchanged nervous, uncertain glances, clearly wanting to believe the comfortable lie. She took another cautious step toward me, her face twisted into a flawless mask of pure counterfeit agony. "Sarah, honey, please listen to me," Brenda pleaded, stretching her arms out as if she desperately wanted to embrace the daughter she had callously tried to murder. "You're incredibly confused right now. Your damaged mind is playing cruel, terrible tricks on you because of the trauma you endured on that mountain. Nobody pushed you. Nobody cut any climbing ropes. You slipped on the wet, dangerous rocks, and I tried with all my physical strength to pull you back up. You are having a severe mental breakdown right now in front of all these lovely, supportive people. We need to get you back to the medical facility immediately before you hurt yourself any further." It was an absolutely brilliant sociopathic performance. She was actively using my visible physical injuries, my arm brace and my bruised face as undeniable proof of my supposed mental instability. A few of the older aristocratic guests actually nodded in sympathetic agreement, murmuring quiet words of pity for a mother dealing with a broken child. Even Todd looked momentarily torn, tearing his eyes away from the staggering embezzlement spreadsheet to look at my battered face. Brenda was banking everything she had on this simple fact that a polite, wealthy society would always prefer the easy narrative of a tragic accident over the grotesque, terrifying reality of a mother attempting to slaughter her own flesh and blood for an insurance payout. I did not raise my voice to argue with her. I did not take a single step backward to defend my own sanity. I just stood perfectly still and stared at her, letting the sheer pathetic desperation of her lies hang thickly in the heavy, perfumed air. "You truly never know when to stop digging your own grave, Mother," I said softly, the absolute certainty in my voice refusing to waver. Detective Miller moved right past me. He did not say a single word to my mother or to the bewildered, anxious crowd. He simply walked with calm, purposeful, authoritative strides directly toward the far corner of the grand ballroom. The expensive event decorator had set up a massive professional audio-visual station there, complete with towering black speakers designed to amplify the string quartet and the emotional eulogies across the expansive, extravagant space. The sound engineer hired for the memorial was standing completely frozen behind his glowing mixing board and, unsure of what to do as a decorated, serious police detective invaded his workspace. Miller reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a standard police-issue smartphone. He grabbed an auxiliary cord resting on the edge of the soundboard and plugged it firmly into his device with deliberate precision. The loud pop of the electronic connection echoed sharply across the room, causing several jittery guests to jump in their gilded chairs. Brenda suddenly stopped her theatrical weeping. The flush of color that had briefly returned to her cheeks vanished once again, leaving her looking like a hollow shell. She stared at the detective with a raw, unfiltered dread, finally beginning to understand that her carefully woven web of deception was about to be permanently and violently dismantled in public. "We strongly prefer to rely on hard forensic evidence rather than manufactured medical speculation," Detective Miller announced, his voice booming through the sophisticated sound system and shaking the crystal centerpieces. He tapped the glowing screen of his phone, holding it up for the entire room to see. The recording was not very long, but the audio quality was brutally, undeniably pristine. It was the exact pocket-dialed voicemail my mother had accidentally left on my phone while I was bleeding out on a narrow, rocky ledge 70 feet below her boots. The entire country club fell into a dead, suffocating silence as Brenda's own distinct voice filled the massive space. "It is done," the recorded voice declared, echoing relentlessly off the expensive chandeliers and the white velvet drapery. The digital sound was utterly devoid of the weeping maternal warmth she had just displayed on stage mere moments ago. It was cold flat and entirely ruthless. I cut the line. She is gone. A collective, horrified gasp tore through the front section. Todd's mother covered her mouth with a trembling hand, her eyes wide with absolute horror. But the damning recording was not finished playing. "Get the insurance paperwork ready," the recorded. Brenda continued her callous words, plunging like a freezing, jagged dagger directly into the heart of the crowd. "Make sure she does not survive if they find her." The audio file ended with a sharp, defining digital click. The ensuing silence in that grand ballroom was so incredibly dense, it felt as though all the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the room. There was no spinning this whatsoever. There was no blaming a severe head injury or a tragic slip on wet, treacherous rocks. Her own unmistakable voice, captured in a moment of pure, unadulterated evil, had just loudly confessed to attempted murder in front of 150 high society witnesses. I looked directly at my mother. The elegant, loving facade was entirely gone, burned away by the harsh light of the truth. She was completely trapped, standing on a lavish stage she had illegally funded with blood money, exposed as a monster to the very people she had spent her entire life trying to impress. Her knees finally gave out. She collapsed heavily onto the polished hardwood floor, her expensive silk dress pooling around her like a dark spreading stain. There was no more gaslighting to be done. There was no more pretending. The ghost had brought the receipts and the resurrection was completely undeniably final. The polished oak floor of the Pinecrest Country Club ballroom seemed to rise up and swallow my mother whole. Brenda did not merely stumble. She completely and utterly collapsed. The heavy silence that had suffocated the room a moment prior was now violently pierced by a sound I had never actually heard from her before. It was a raw, guttural sob. These were not the delicate, theatrical sniffles she had dabbed away with a lace handkerchief just minutes earlier. These were authentic, agonizing tears born of absolute, unadulterated terror. She sat crumpled in a pile of extremely expensive black silk, her vintage pearls rattling against the hardwood as her chest heaved with panicked, ragged breaths. The grand illusion of the grieving aristocratic mother evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a cornered, desperate criminal who finally understood she had nowhere left to hide. Her manicured hands clawed at the pristine floor, as if she could somehow dig a tunnel straight out of the country club and away from the devastating consequences of her own boundless greed. I stood towering above her, feeling a strange, quiet emptiness where the pain of her betrayal used to reside. She looked so incredibly small, surrounded by the towering arrangements of rare white orchids that she had purchased with the premium placed on my life. Detective Miller did not hesitate for a single second. He stepped out from the shadows of the center aisle, moving with the deliberate, heavy authority of a man who had spent his entire career hunting monsters, hiding behind expensive gated communities. He bypassed the stunned high society guests, the paralyzed bankers, and the horrified real estate moguls without casting them a single glance. He stopped right beside my mother, looking down at her weeping form with absolute clinical disgust. "Brenda," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through her hysterical sobbing, "you are officially under arrest for the attempted murder of your own daughter, Sarah." He reached to his belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic rattle of the chains echoed loudly over the sophisticated sound system. Brenda scrambled backwards, sliding against the base of the marble podium, begging him to wait, screaming that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. She looked up at me, her makeup smeared and ruined, silently pleading for the daughter she had tried to slaughter to intervene on her behalf. I gave her absolutely nothing. I simply stared back with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the mountain river she had dropped me into. Miller grabbed her wrists with practiced efficiency, pulling her arms firmly behind her back. The loud, defining click of the cuffs locking into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "The charges do not stop there," Brenda the detective continued loudly, ensuring every wealthy ear in the room caught the full magnitude of her crimes. "You are also being charged with massive federal wire fraud and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Over by the front row, the sheer gravity of the situation finally registered in my sister's thoroughly panicked brain. Chloe had just watched our mother, the supposed untouchable mastermind of our family, get shackled like a common street thief. She looked at the manila folder, still resting near Todd, feed the undeniable spreadsheet proving her $2.5 million embezzlement. She looked at Todd, whose face was carved out of pure stone, radiating an icy, unyielding fury. Her golden ticket was completely gone. Her fraudulent safety net was shredded. Pure, raw survival instinct completely overrode any lingering shred of country club dignity Chloe possessed. She did not try to argue or beg for mercy. She simply hiked up the heavy black fabric of her lavish morning dress, kicked off her expensive designer heels, and bolted. She scrambled past the row of gilded chairs, sprinting wildly down the side aisle toward the heavy velvet curtains that concealed the back catering exit. She moved with frantic, desperate speed, shoving a shocked waiter out of her path, causing a silver tray of premium champagne flutes to crash loudly to the ground. The shattered glass scattered across the expensive rugs, mirroring the complete destruction of her perfect life. But Victoria Gallagher and Detective Miller had not left a single exit unmonitored. As Chloe threw her entire body weight against the heavy swinging kitchen doors, she slammed directly into a solid wall of dark blue uniforms. Two federal officers, who had been quietly waiting in the service corridor, stepped forward immediately, blocking her frantic escape route. Chloe shrieked, a loud feral sound of complete defeat thrashing wildly against the officers as they took firm hold of her bare arms. "Let go of me!" she screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "I am a victim here. I did not do anything wrong. You have to let me go." One of the officers quickly overpowered her, securing her wrists behind her back and locking her in identical steel cuffs. "Chloe, you are under arrest for massive grand larceny and conspiracy to commit federal insurance fraud," the officer stated, his voice booming down the hallway and spilling out into the main ballroom. "You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be provided for you." She twisted violently in their grip, turning her tear-streaked face back toward the main room. "Todd," she shrieked, sobbing uncontrollably, dropping entirely to her knees. "Todd, please help me. Please tell them it is a mistake. I will pay it back. I swear I will pay it all back. Just do not let them take me to prison." Todd simply stood from his seat, meticulously adjusting his tailored suit jacket. He looked at his weeping, handcuffed wife with a chilling, absolute detachment. He did not say a single reassuring word. He just slowly turned his back on her and walked toward his parents, leaving Chloe to drown completely in the massive ocean of financial lies she had created. The reaction from the 150 exclusive guests was utterly mesmerizing. These were the exact same people Brenda and Chloe had spent years desperately trying to impress, the very elite circle they had sacrificed my life to maintain. The wealthy matrons and powerful executives were no longer wiping away sympathetic tears. They were reaching eagerly into their expensive purses and tailored pockets, pulling out their smartphones. The bright flashes of dozens of cameras began to illuminate the darkened ballroom. They were actively recording every single second of my mother being hauled to her feet and my sister being dragged sobbing through the catering doors. The very society they worshipped was now eagerly documenting their absolute ruin, turning their darkest moment of utter destruction into high-definition neighborhood gossip. I stood completely still, taking a deep, steadying breath of the floral-scented air, watching the flashing camera lights capture the exact moment my family was permanently erased from the world of the privileged and thrust directly into the cold, harsh reality of the criminal justice system. The chaotic symphony of flashing smartphone cameras and overlapping shocked gasps slowly faded into a tense, terrified hush as the uniformed officers pulled my mother and sister to their feet. Brenda looked like a crumpled, discarded marionette. Her expensive silk morning dress completely ruined her wrists, securely bound behind her back in heavy steel. Chloe was still weeping uncontrollably, her dark mascara running in jagged lines down her pale cheeks, stripped entirely of her golden child arrogance. But the final act of this magnificent tragedy was not quite finished. While Detective Miller handled the criminal aspects of my family betrayal, my fiercely brilliant estate attorney Victoria Gallagher was about to execute the ultimate financial death blow. Victoria smoothed the lapels of her sharp-tailored suit and walked with supreme, unyielding confidence right past my handcuffed relatives. She did not even spare them a fleeting glance. She moved directly to the polished marble podium that my mother had occupied just minutes earlier. The very same spot where Brenda had stood and delivered a sickeningly sweet fake eulogy to her wealthy friends. Victoria leaned into the microphone. The soft electronic feedback echoed sharply through the grand ballroom, instantly commanding the undivided attention of the 150 high society guests who remained completely paralyzed in their gilded chairs. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria began, her voice ringing with the crisp, undeniable authority of a woman who dismantled massive corporate frauds for a living. "Since we have all been gathered here today under the false guise of honoring Sarah's memory and celebrating her family legacy, it seems only fitting that we officially conclude the business of her estate. As many of you in this room are likely aware, Sarah's late father left behind a substantial trust fund. It was an ironclad protective financial instrument currently valued at exactly $4 million. Victoria paused intentionally, letting the massive dollar amount hang heavy in the floral-scented air. I watched Todd parents exchange a sharp, knowing look of profound realization. The country club elite leaned forward collectively, holding their breath. The original terms of that trust were incredibly specific. Victoria continued pacing slowly across the stage, so every single person could hear her perfectly. Sarah was designated as the sole primary trustee, holding strict discretionary power over the funds until certain age milestones were met. Brenda and Chloe were listed only as contingent beneficiaries. In the event of Sarah's untimely death, the entire $4 million fortune was legally scheduled to bypass the standard trust restrictions and disperse directly into their pockets. That was the exact calculated motive behind the brutal events on the mountain. My mother and sister desperately needed Sarah to be dead, so they could instantly unlock that money to cover Chloe's massive corporate embezzlement and secure Brenda a luxurious retirement. Brenda let out a ragged, choking gasp from the back of the room where the federal officers were holding her. She shook her head frantically, but her voice was utterly gone, stolen by the sheer terror of her reality. Chloe simply squeezed her eyes shut tight, as if that could somehow block out the devastating words echoing through the sophisticated sound system. However, Victoria said, a sharp, predatory smile finally touching the corners of her mouth. There is a very specific, incredibly ancient piece of legal doctrine that governs this exact type of horrific familial betrayal. It is formally known in the legal community as the Slayer Statute. It is a fundamental law built on a very simple, universally understood concept. A murderer is never under any circumstances allowed to financially profit from their crime. Victoria opened her thick leather binder and pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper, holding it high up for the entire ballroom to witness. By actively attempting to end Sarah's life to trigger the inheritance clause, Brenda has legally triggered the Slayer Statute. Victoria announced, her voice rising with absolute undeniable triumph. Furthermore, because we have undeniable recorded proof and concrete financial trails linking Chloe directly to the insurance fraud and the murderous cover-up, she's legally classified as a co-conspirator to the attempted homicide. The law explicitly strips any and all inheritance rights from anyone convicted of causing or conspiring to cause the violent death of the primary beneficiary. I watched this devastating reality of the law completely crush my mother. The very act she had ruthlessly orchestrated to secure her wealthy future was the exact legal mechanism that would permanently strip her of it. It was a poetic, magnificent irony. She had sliced my climbing rope to steal $4 million, and in doing so, she had legally burned her own golden inheritance straight to the ground. Because Sarah is very much alive, and because you two have willfully committed violent felonies against her. Victoria continued, looking directly past the wealthy crowd and pointing a perfectly manicured finger straight at my handcuffed mother. Neither of you will ever see a single red cent of that money. You are both completely and irrevocably disinherited. Your names have been permanently legally struck from the trust documents. You have zero claim to the estate, zero claim to the family home, and absolutely zero access to any of the remaining financial accounts. Chloe let out a fresh, desperate wail, slumping her dead weight against the uniform of the federal officer holding her. Todd simply turned his back on her entirely, walking swiftly away toward the club exit, with his parents leaving his soon-to-be ex-wife to face her ruin alone. The entire $4 million trust now belongs solely, entirely, and unconditionally to Sarah. Victoria declared, closing her heavy leather binder with a loud, definitive snap. She has complete, absolute control over every single asset. You risked your entire lives to steal her future, Brenda. And in the end, you simply handed her the absolute key to destroy yours. I stood quietly in the center aisle, my injured arm tucked securely in its brace, watching the officers finally march my mother and sister out through the heavy oak doors. The grand ballroom was dead silent, save for the fading sounds of Chloe's hysterical sobbing. They had tried to bury me in a dark, freezing river gorge, but I had crawled out of that grave and brought a federal hammer down on their heads. They were leaving the country club in the back of a police cruiser, entirely penniless, completely disgraced, and facing decades behind bars. And I was walking out of my own lavish memorial service as the sole unquestioned master of my own life. Exactly 6 months had passed since the heavy oak doors of the Pinecrest Country Club slammed shut on my mother's extravagant web of lies. 6 months since I walked out of my own lavish memorial service and stepped into a completely new reality. My fractured ribs had finally knit back together. The heavy black medical brace was permanently gone, replaced by the effortless drape of a tailored navy trench coat. I was completely in control of my father's $4 million trust, and for the first time in my 29 years, I was finally breathing free air. But there was one absolutely final loose thread that needed to be permanently severed. That is why I found myself driving through a freezing torrential downpour toward the imposing concrete fortress of the state penitentiary. The maximum security facility sat isolated on a barren stretch of grey industrial land, looking like a massive brutal scar against the overcast horizon. It was the absolute antithesis of the manicured lawns and sweeping golf courses Brenda had dedicated her entire existence to worshipping. I walked through the stark, sterile lobby, handing over my government identification and submitting to a rigorous physical security screening. There were no smiling valets here. There were no eager waiters offering flutes of premium champagne. There was only the harsh, deafening clang of heavy steel doors sliding shut behind me and the suffocating scent of cheap industrial bleach. I followed a stern, uniformed guard down a long, windowless corridor, my low heels clicking rhythmically against the scuffed linoleum floor. Every single step carried me further away from the vulnerable daughter I used to be. I was directed into a narrow, brightly lit visitation booth. A thick slab of reinforced, smudge-proof glass separated my side of the room from the inmate holding area. I sat down on the hard plastic chair and waited. A few minutes later, a heavy metal door on the opposite side buzzed loudly. I honestly did not recognize the woman who shuffled slowly into the small enclosed space. The magnificent high society matriarch who had commanded the attention of the suburban elite was completely and utterly gone. Brenda looked like she had aged 20 years in a matter of months. Her perfectly coiffed, highlighted hair had grown out into dull, brittle streaks of gray, pulled back into a sloppy, uneven ponytail. The expertly applied makeup that used to hide her true nature had been entirely washed away, revealing deep, exhausted ravines and dark, sunken hollows around her eyes. She wore a shapeless, bright orange jumpsuit that hung loosely off her diminishing frame, completely replacing her custom-tailored black silk and vintage pearls. She looked incredibly small, entirely ordinary, and deeply pathetic. She sat down heavily on the stool across from me, her hands trembling wildly as she reached for the black plastic telephone receiver mounted to the painted concrete wall. I picked up my own receiver, pressing it to my ear. The electronic connection crackled loudly, breaking the tense, heavy silence between us. Sarah Brenda whispered, her voice rough and heavily laced with a frantic, breathless desperation. "Oh, my sweet girl, you actually came. I prayed every single night in my dark cell that you would come to see me. I prayed you would find it in your heart to grant me just a few minutes of your time." I said absolutely nothing. I simply sat there and watched her squirm under the flickering fluorescent lights. The sheer lack of validation seemed to completely unnerve her. "Please, you have to understand the absolute nightmare we were living in," Brenda continued, pressing her pale face closer to the thick glass. Chloe had gotten us into such massive, terrible trouble. The corporate auditors were practically knocking down our front doors. We were facing complete financial ruin and absolute public disgrace. The sheer suffocating panic of losing everything your father built completely clouded my judgment. We were cornered, Sarah. We were totally out of options. What happened up on that mountain, on that wet, dangerous trail, was just a terrible, spontaneous mistake. It was a momentary lapse of sanity born out of pure, blinding financial desperation. I was not myself. It was a singular moment of utter madness. Please tell me you can find some small fraction of forgiveness in your soul for a desperate, terrified mother. She pressed her palm flat against the reinforced glass, hot, fresh tears spilling rapidly down her weathered cheeks. This time the weeping was undeniably genuine. It was not a calculated country club performance designed to solicit pity from wealthy bankers. It was the raw, ugly terror of a woman facing the rest of her natural life trapped inside a concrete box. I looked at her hand resting against the barrier and felt absolutely no urge to mirror the gesture. I kept my hands resting calmly in my lap. "You're still trying to rewrite the narrative, Brenda," I said, my voice perfectly steady, radiating a cold, absolute certainty. "You are still hoping that if you play the role of the overwhelmed, panicked victim, I will somehow magically forget the brutal, unvarnished facts. You desperately want me to believe that slicing through my climbing rope while I hung 70 feet above a rocky river gorge was a spontaneous mistake. You want me to view your attempted murder as a tragic momentary lapse of sanity." I leaned slightly closer to the glass, locking my eyes directly onto hers, refusing to let her look away. "But we both know that is a complete, absolute lie," I stated firmly. "A moment of madness happens in a matter of seconds. Taking out a massive $1.5 million life insurance policy, in my name, forging my digital signature, and quietly waiting for the legal activation period to clear does not happen in a few seconds. You executed that fraudulent policy exactly 6 months before you ever invited me on that hiking trip. You meticulously packed a serrated tactical blade into your designer bag, knowing exactly what you were going to use it for the second we reached the summit. That is not a spontaneous mistake born of sudden financial panic. That is calculated, cold-blooded, premeditated evil. You planned my slaughter for half a year just so you could maintain your membership at a country club." The desperate, hopeful light completely vanished from Brenda's eyes. Her mouth opened in a silent, horrified gasp as the undeniable weight of her own meticulously planned cruelty was thrown right back in her face. She had absolutely no defense left. No more graceful excuses, no more societal lies to hide behind. The illusion was completely, permanently shattered. "I do not forgive you," I said, my tone completely stripped of any remaining emotion. "I will never forgive you, and I will never ever come to this horrible place again. You have exactly what you earned." Without waiting for a single word of response, I calmly reached over and placed the heavy black receiver back onto its metal hook. The line went instantly dead entirely, severing her frantic, weeping voice from my world forever. I stood up from the hard plastic chair, smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy coat, and turned my back on the visitation window. I walked straight down the long, sterile concrete hallway toward the heavy steel exit doors, never once looking back at the broken woman sobbing violently on the other side of the glass. I stepped out into the freezing, cleansing rain, completely ready to live the rest of my beautiful, unburdened life. The heavy mahogany doors of the federal courthouse swung shut with a resounding thud that echoed like a final, undeniable judgment. I sat in the polished wooden pew of the gallery, watching the pale afternoon sunlight filter through the tall arched windows, casting long, dramatic shadows across the marble floor. It had been an exhausting, grueling marathon of legal proceedings, but today was the absolute culmination of it all. Today was the day my sister Chloe finally ran out of other people's money to hide behind. The air in the courtroom was stifling thick with the kind of sterile bureaucratic tension that only exists right before a life is permanently altered by the strike of a wooden gavel. The complete dismantling of her perfectly curated high society existence had actually begun months before this trial even started. Todd did not waste a single second lingering in the toxic fallout of her massive betrayal. The very morning after our catastrophic confrontation at the country club, his high-powered corporate attorneys filed emergency divorce papers. It was a completely ruthless surgical strike. Todd froze every joint bank account, cancelled every platinum credit card, and legally evicted her from their sprawling suburban estate. He completely, legally, and financially amputated her from his life. Chloe was suddenly shoved out into the cold, harsh reality of the real world with absolutely nothing but a suitcase of designer clothes she could no longer afford and a rapidly mounting pile of devastating legal bills. The wealthy, influential friends she had spent years desperately trying to impress instantly evaporated, turning their backs the exact moment his family name was no longer shielding her. Because she was completely cut off from the massive family fortune, Chloe was forced to rely on an overworked public defender who looked chronically exhausted. Watching her sit at the defense table day after day was a bizarre, completely surreal experience. The glamorous, arrogant, golden child who had glided effortlessly through life on unearned privilege was entirely gone. She wore a dull, shapeless gray suit, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe plain knot. She constantly chewed on her cuticles, darting panicked, frantic glances toward the jury box, hoping to magically charm them with her watery, pleading eyes. But federal juries do not care about country club pedigrees or fake tears. They care about paper trails, and the paper trail she left behind was an absolute disaster. The sheer irony of her situation was that her massive downfall was caused by the exact same character flaw that had defined her entire existence. She was fundamentally, completely lazy. She had always refused to do any actual honest work, relying instead on manipulation and endless entitlement. Even her corporate embezzlement was executed with a shocking lack of sophisticated effort. During my testimony as an expert witness, I had to walk the court through her sloppy offshore dummy corporations and her blatantly forged vendor invoices. She had stolen $2.5 million to pay off predatory loan sharks because she desperately wanted the lavish lifestyle without ever breaking a sweat to earn it. She expected the world to simply hand her everything on a silver platter. And when it did not, she lazily chose to steal it instead. It took the jury less than 4 hours to deliberate. When the foreman stood up and read the verdict, the word guilty echoed across the silent room like a sequence of heavy physical blows. Guilty of grand larceny, guilty of wire fraud, guilty of conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. Chloe folded in on herself completely, as if her spine had simply vanished. She sobbed openly, burying her face in her hands, but there was no enabling mother there to coddle her, and no wealthy husband to buy her way out of the consequences. She was entirely, completely alone, facing the terrifying reality of her own wretched choices. The judge was a stern, uncompromising man who looked down at my weeping sister with absolute zero sympathy. He delivered a scathing final reprimand that cut through her pathetic sobbing with surgical precision. He explicitly noted that her crimes were not born of desperation or survival or necessity, but of pure, unadulterated selfishness and an overwhelming sense of toxic entitlement. He sentenced Chloe to 12 years in a maximum security federal correctional institution with absolutely no possibility of early parole. Furthermore, he ordered her to pay full restitution to the logistics firm, ensuring she would remain permanently crippled by massive debt for the rest of her natural life. I watched quietly as the federal marshals stepped forward. They securely fastened the heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. As they turned her to lead her out of the courtroom, she stopped and looked directly at me. Her eyes were red and swollen, filled with a hollow, terrified recognition of what her future permanently held. There was no apology in her gaze, only the absolute crushing despair of a woman who had finally run out of lies. I did not smile. I did not wave. I simply looked back at her with a calm, steady detachment, letting her see that the sister she had bullied, manipulated, and tried to discard was the only one walking out of those doors as a free, independent woman. Walking down the wide stone steps of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, I took a deep, cleansing breath. The heavy, suffocating shadows of my biological family could never reach me again. The golden child who had expected to inherit the world was now locked inside a concrete cage, completely stripped of the unearned luxury she had valued above human life. She lost the mansion, the luxury cars, the perfect marriage, and her freedom, all because she absolutely refused to put in an honest day's work. She had built her entire identity on a fragile foundation of sand and lies, and the tide of justice had finally washed it all completely away. My life is finally my own now, totally free from their toxic grasp. I am focusing entirely on my career, my peace, and the genuine friends who became the family I actually chose to love. If you have stayed with me through this incredible journey, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Remember that no matter how much someone tries to make you feel small or invisible, your truth and your integrity will always be your greatest weapons. Setting firm, absolute boundaries with toxic family members is never an act of betrayal. It is a necessary act of basic survival. I would love to hear your thoughts on this journey. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace and sanity? Please leave a comment down below and tell me your story. Also, let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can keep connecting through these stories of truth and justice. Take care of yourselves and never stop fighting for the life you truly deserve. The morning wind blowing off the coastal bay always carries the distinct scent of fresh starts and absolute freedom. I stood on the expansive wraparound mahogany balcony of my new home, gripping a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee with both hands. My fingers were perfectly steady. The dull, persistent ache in my ribs that had served as a daily physical reminder of the terrifying plunge down the mountain had finally entirely vanished. I took a deep, cleansing breath, feeling my lungs expand effortlessly without a single twinge of pain. The restrictive black medical brace, the sterile hospital rooms, and the grueling physical therapy sessions all felt like they belonged to a completely different lifetime. I looked out over the lush rolling green hills and the distant crashing ocean waves. I had purchased this beautiful, sprawling modern property entirely in cash. I used the exact $4 million trust fund my mother and sister had so desperately tried to slaughter me for. It was an incredibly peaceful sanctuary built on a solid foundation of undeniable truth, rather than stolen money and shallow country club lies. I absolutely refused to let that massive inheritance turn me into a lazy, entitled socialite. That was Chloe's desired path, and I had personally orchestrated the violent collision between her unearned arrogance and a federal judge. Instead, I chose to channel my immense financial resources and my forensic accounting expertise into something profoundly meaningful. Exactly 4 months ago, I officially opened the heavy glass doors to my own independent forensic accounting firm, right in the bustling heart of the financial district. I leased a beautiful, bright office space overlooking the skyline, hired a dedicated team of brilliant junior investigators, and built a practice with a very specific, unwavering mission. My firm is exclusively dedicated to assisting vulnerable victims of familial financial abuse and intricate domestic fraud. I spend my days meticulously tracing hidden offshore assets, exposing blatantly forged signatures, and dismantling the deceptive financial webs that toxic relatives weave around their unsuspecting victims. Just last week, I sat across a polished conference table from a terrified young woman who had been systematically robbed blind by her own trusted guardian. She was completely paralyzed by fear, utterly convinced she was losing her mind because her abuser kept aggressively gaslighting her into silence. I knew exactly how that suffocating darkness felt. I recognized the raw panic swimming in her eyes because I had stared at that exact same haunted reflection in my own mirror for years. Handing her a comprehensive, impeccably documented file proving her guardian theft was one of the most intensely rewarding moments of my entire professional career. I am actively using my lifelong expertise to hand innocent people the exact same heavy iron anchor of truth that I dropped on Todd and his powerful family. I give them the undeniable mathematics of their betrayal so they can finally break free and permanently reclaim their stolen lives. Looking back at the absolute smoldering wreckage of my biological family, I realize something that still occasionally surprises me. I do not feel a single ounce of sorrow, regret, or misplaced guilt. For 29 exhausting years, I had agonized over my desperate inability to fit into Brenda and Chloe's superficial, hollow universe. I had drained my own spirit, trying to earn the basic maternal love and sibling loyalty that should have been freely given from birth. I genuinely thought the lack of affection was my own fault. I believed my strict dedication to hard work and practical living made me somehow defective in a family that worshipped vintage pearls designer labels and toxic appearances. But standing here, breathing this crisp, clean air, I finally fully understand that losing my biological family was actually the absolute greatest gift I have ever received in my entire life. Their forced departure violently cleared the toxic, festering rot from my daily existence. It permanently severed the heavy, suffocating vines of emotional manipulation and constant psychological abuse that had kept me intentionally small. My mother and sister never viewed me as a vibrant, living human being. I was simply a convenient, disposable asset, a quiet background character they could exploit and ultimately eliminate when their massive financial lies threatened to ruin their perfect facade. Stripping them of their unearned inheritance and sending them to maximum security federal prison was not an act of petty vengeance. It was a massive necessary act of spiritual and physical survival. the sheer peaceful quiet in my life now is truly beautiful. There is absolutely no more gaslighting. There are no more cruel, subtle insults delivered over expensive catered dinner tables. There is no more looking nervously over my shoulder, wondering when the people supposed to protect me will finally decide to push me over a literal cliff. The immense void left by their imprisonment did not remain empty for long. Once the sprawling invasive weeds of a toxic family are pulled entirely out by the roots, a beautiful garden actually has the space to grow. I have deliberately surrounded myself with incredible people who value me for my character and my integrity, not my bank account balance. Detective Miller still checks in on me periodically, stopping by the new firm to share a quiet cup of coffee and swap stories about catching the bad guys. Victoria Gallagher, the brilliant, fierce attorney who helped me secure my financial survival, has become an incredibly close personal friend and a trusted professional mentor. They stood firmly by me when I was a battered, bruised ghost, fighting for my basic right to exist. They are my chosen family, bound tightly by mutual respect and unwavering honesty. The scars from that freezing, treacherous mountain will always be a part of my physical body. Faint silver lines tracing the memory of the jagged rocks and the desperate freezing scramble for survival. But they are no longer shameful marks of victimhood. They are undeniable physical proof that I'm a fierce, relentless survivor. I walked through the absolute darkest valley of human betrayal, and I emerged completely unbroken. I built my own table, and I get to decide exactly who is allowed to sit at it. If you have stayed with me through this exhausting, incredible journey, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Remember that walking away from toxic people, even if they share your blood, is never a betrayal. It is the courageous first step towards saving your own life. Please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Have you ever had to draw a permanent line with toxic family members to protect your peace? I read every single comment. Do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing these vital stories of ultimate truth and justice. Take care of yourselves and never stop fighting for the life you truly deserve. We grow up completely saturated in a very specific, powerful societal myth. From the moment we are old enough to comprehend spoken language, we are constantly fed the exact same relentless narrative about unconditional love and absolute family loyalty. We see it broadcast on television screens, we hear it from our well-meaning neighbors, and it is preached heavily from the pulpits of our local communities. Society conditions us to believe that the people who share our genetic code possess an inherent magical goodness. We are told that this biological connection automatically overrides any terrible destructive thing they might choose to do to us. We are instructed to endure, to endlessly forgive, to turn the other cheek, and to keep the ugly, humiliating secrets quietly locked away behind beautiful, heavy oak doors. You are told that family is everything and that family must always come first. You are reminded that you only get one mother and you only get one sister. Those heavy phrases are hammered into our developing minds like iron nails securing a rigid wooden frame. But living through the absolute darkest depths of human betrayal has taught me a profoundly different and highly liberating truth. When you are the designated scapegoat of a broken household, you are programmed to accept a fraction of the love you actually deserve. You spend decades twisting your own personality into smaller and quieter shapes, desperately hoping to finally earn a permanent seat at the family dinner table. You accept the leftover crumbs of affection and try to convince yourself it is a massive, lavish feast. I spent 29 agonizing years existing in that exact suffocating dynamic. I watched my golden child sister receive endless praise and financial bailouts, while my own quiet achievements and financial stability were completely ignored or ruthlessly exploited. I honestly believed that if I just worked harder, if I remained perfectly agreeable, and if I never complained, my mother would eventually look at me with genuine pride. I thought I could somehow magically cure their toxic dysfunction with my own endless patience and financial generosity. I was catastrophically wrong. We are universally taught that blood is thicker than water. It is a very convenient, comfortable proverb for people who have never had to fight for their literal lives against the very individuals who brought them into the world. It is a platitude designed to keep victims compliant and quiet. But sometimes, blood is not a protective shield at all. Sometimes blood is just the exact thing that stains you. It deeply stains your spirit, your fragile sense of self-worth, and your fundamental human ability to trust anyone else. My mother and my sister weaponized their blood connection to entirely mask a cold, calculated, insatiable greed. They hid their monstrous intentions behind the highly respectable, polished facade of suburban motherhood and deep sisterly affection. They actively used my desperate biological desire for a normal, loving family as a heavy blindfold, so I would not see the sharp, serrated knife they were holding right in front of my face. They orchestrated my demise with a terrifying, calm precision that still chills me to the bone. I had to learn the hardest, most agonizing way imaginable, that true lasting loyalty is never an automatic birthright. Genuine loyalty must be consistently and actively earned through mutual respect, through unwavering honesty, and through basic, consistent human decency. When a parent or a sibling completely fails to provide those fundamental basic necessities, they absolutely forfeit their right to your lifelong devotion. People in polite society will often try to tell you that walking away from your family is a selfish, extreme act of ultimate betrayal. They will quickly judge your difficult choices from the comfortable, unearned safety of their unbroken, happy homes. They will demand that you keep trying to fix something that was broken long before you were even born. But I'm standing here today to tell you with absolute, unshakable certainty that setting firm, unyielding boundaries is not a betrayal. Those boundaries are pure, unadulterated survival. You cannot repeatedly set yourself on fire simply to keep toxic, manipulative people warm. You cannot allow yourself to be forcefully dragged down to the dark bottom of a freezing river gorge, just so someone else can float comfortably on the surface and collect a massive insurance payout. Protecting your own peace, protecting your sanity, and securing your physical safety is the single most important fundamental obligation you have to yourself in this world. You have an absolute right to exist peacefully without being treated as a disposable financial asset. I know there are people listening to my voice right now who are silently carrying the exact same heavy, crushing, invisible burdens. You might be a woman in your 50s or 60s, sitting in a perfectly decorated living room, feeling completely invisible and entirely unloved by the relatives sitting right next to you. You might be dealing with siblings who systematically drain your retirement finances, who verbally attack your character, or who continuously gaslight you into believing that their toxic abuse is somehow your own personal failure. You might be standing at the terrifying precipice of a massive life-altering decision, wondering if you actually possess the physical and emotional strength to finally pack your bags, change your house, locks, or permanently walk away from the only community you have ever known. The grief of mourning a family member who is still breathing is a very unique, specific kind of torture. But the absolute glorious freedom waiting for you on the other side of that agonizing grief is worth every single tear you will cry. If you have ever had to sever ties with toxic family members to save your own life, metaphorically or literally, I want you to know that you are absolutely not alone. There is a massive, beautiful community of strong, resilient survivors out here who understand exactly what you have endured. We see you, we validate your pain, and we celebrate your immense courage. Please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to grow this supportive space. Leave a comment below telling me exactly where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I truly love reading about where my story is reaching people around the world. Remember, your inherent worth is never determined by those who completely fail to see it. Take care of yourselves and never stop defending your absolute right to a peaceful, happy life.